Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Good turnout here in Birmingham. My name is Anthony Lilley. I'm in my day job a creative industries producer and small investor. People make grants and technical scenarios too. And in this particular role, I am the chair of the Creative Clusters programme for the AHRC. I'm a council member of the AHRC, and I also have a professorship in creative industries at the University of Ulster. So my job is, I was involved from very early on in putting together what the programme should be with the AHRC team, led by Professor Andrew Thompson, the Chief Executive of the AHRC, who can't be here with us today, but sends his best wishes. And I was involved very early on in putting together what this programme should be, and in helping to secure the funding that we are about to talk to you about. My career sort of splits essentially in between being in the creative industries and either academic or consultancy or sort of regulatory roles, thinking about and sort of cogitating on the creative industries. Most of my work in the producing side of my life has been on the edge in between media and platforms. So I've worked in games, I've worked in telly, I've worked in apps and online. I've also done live theatre and various other things. I started in the digital media business before we knew what that was, which ages me considerably, as Andrew Chitty, who you'll meet a lot later, never tires of pointing out. It's great to have you here. What we're going to do today, as you can see from the agenda, is we're going to talk in the morning, and we've got a couple of keynote addresses, very distinguished keynotes from Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, who you'll know, and Professor Sir David Eastwood, down here, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, to sort of set the scene. And then Andrew Chitty and the team from the AHRC will come up and they will tell you more in detail about the programme of work and what the clusters programme is all about. And then later on, before lunch, I'll chair a panel discussion, where we'll just try and get some perspectives on what might constitute a successful cluster, what kinds of work it might do, how it might be structured, whatever comes up really. And we'll open up both Andrew Chitty's session and the session that I'm doing, the panel session, to discussion and questions from the floor. So I'll just give you a quick headline summary if you haven't seen the documentation or haven't had time to look at what this programme is about. You'll hear this a few times during the day, but we'll try and not repeat it too much. The programme is funded by something called the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which is part of the government's wider industrial strategy, which is a very large £4 billion plus investment of new money into research, innovation and growth sectors, and it includes investments some of which are landed already here in the West Midlands, I believe, in battery technology and autonomous vehicles, and Andrew Chitty will talk to you about that a little bit more later. This investment in particular, I think it's the first investment of this kind of funds at this kind of scale in the creative industries. And that is something that a lot of people, including people in this room, should be proud of having made the case for. That the creative industries, as we'll talk about later, we are of such scale and importance and such potential that they're recognised already as a key part in the first wave of funding of the government's industrial strategy. They're recognised as being a significant piece. So this is a significant programme of work. It'll be somewhere around about the 80 million mark by the time we get to the end of it, and that will become clear why that number is a variable later on. It's a large-scale piece of work. What are the points of emphasis of it? The industrial strategy is about growth, it's about jobs, it's about skills, it's about productivity, it's about the long-term potential of the UK. That's what it's trying to do, their laudable aims. So this programme of work, the Clusters programme, has as its sort of overarching set of objectives to contribute very positively to the growth and resilience and innovation potential of the creative industries by connecting up companies and our research base, our world-class education, higher education base, so that people can work together and collaborate in new ways on specific challenges which have the potential to deliver growth and jobs and all of those key strategic political objectives. it's sort of one way of encapsulating this, and apologies to my team in the room who've heard this a lot of times from me in the last couple of weeks, is to say that I'm spending parts of my life as the chair of this with two categories of people who use the term VC to indicate what their lives are. Vice Chancellors like David and venture capitalists at the other end of, I'm going to say spectrum. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, but at a different position. Vice Chancellors mostly have been extremely encouraging, but it does take a little bit of explaining what kind of money this is. It's not traditional research money, which we measured in terms of publications and purely in terms of academic outputs. And mostly they understand that. Some actually are not entirely keen on the idea of this very sort of instrumental, hypothecated, if you like. This money that's got to do a certain thing. This money's got strings attached. Some are not entirely keen on that, and I can understand why, but actually the truth is this is what this money is for, this is what it's going to be used for. Doing it successfully is what keeps me and Andrew and others of us out of the clutches of the Public Accounts Committee and the National Audit Office. We've got to get this right. It's a big sum of money. We've got to do it well. At the other end, the VCs are sort of a little bit miffed in a different way, because this is not money that goes straight into industry. It's not money that goes straight into the pre-market sort of incubator or scale-up businesses. That's not what it's for either. And I think one of the things we have to be very clear on is there's a lot this money could do, but there are some things it has to do. And I sort of feel reasonably comfortable that some VCs who run universities are a bit uncomfortable, and some VCs who run funds are a bit uncomfortable. That suggests there's a middle ground we're in, which might be quite constructive and productive. So as you listen throughout the day, I would hold in your head, hold in your mind those kind of framing ideas. That's why we're trying to do this. That's broadly what we're trying to do. What I think you'll discover is that we've tried to leave the how piece very open. So clusters are the key mechanism, and Andrew will talk about this a great deal more, and there are lots of discussions about what's a cluster, how big's a cluster, when is it a cluster, lots of interesting things to consider. But clusters are the key mechanism, which means there will be up to 8 clusters around the country. They will have probably a sort of geographical centre, but we won't be drawing a sort of circle around the city and saying if you're not inside this sort of wall, you're not in the cluster. That would be mad. They may well have relationships to large companies and supply chains. But the idea is that when creative industries companies collaborate, work together, and they work in clusters with the higher education sector and others, and LEPs and politicians, and they really focus on a challenge and get behind it, that's when growth and innovation can occur. It's not the only set of conditions, but it is a set of conditions under which growth and innovation can occur. So that's our thesis, if you like. That's our sort of model for this. And in this program, the clusters have to tell us what challenge they feel they are uniquely able to deal with, both because of their higher education skills and because of the companies that are part of their cluster, their partnership, and because of the history and the possible future potential of their cluster. So it is about identifying in close collaboration with industry what is possible, what is necessary, and then explaining, in very simple terms, how you're the people who can do it. And that sounds very simple in a way, and it is very simple in a way, but it's extraordinarily hard to actually do. So we appreciate that this is not business as usual, either for industry players or for higher education players, and we don't apologise for that. This is a particular kind of funding which is trying to achieve a particular kind of step change and growth. The review that Sir Peter Bazalgette just did in the creative industry, which was published a couple of weeks ago, suggested that the creative industries could drive 1 million new jobs by 2030. I don't know where that number came from. It's suspiciously round, as these numbers usually are, but it is an objective of scale. And we, in this programme, need to be playing a part in helping that to become a reality over the course of the next several years that we're funding. So that's a sort of setting out of the landscape, if you like. My job is to now introduce our first keynote speaker, who will be known to everybody in the room. It's with great pleasure that I'd like to welcome to the stage, please, Andy Street, CBE, who's the Mayor of the West Midlands, who's going to open our proceedings. Morning, Andy. You're very welcome.
Good morning to you, Anthony. Thank you. Now, I haven't got a microphone, so I'm told I just have to...
You can just come and stand here.
Behind now. I don't like standing in a fixed point though, but I will do it as that's the rules of the
You can
game
project,
today.
it's
That's
fine.
all right, of course, no problem at all. Okay, so good morning everybody, and brilliant to be here. Truth is, I'm what you might call a late entrant at the Secret Policeman's Ball, as the radio programme says, because I wasn't going to be coming to this event. I was going to leave David to tell the story, and he's told me, be brief, don't steal any of my lines. I've got very clear instructions. But I did want to come. So you've been fitted in between the Bus Alliance, gosh, I have an exciting time, and the future of metro extensions and how we make the case for that. But I wanted to come because this is genuinely very important to the future of the West Midlands. And I met the chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Andrew Thompson, who I don't think is here today, but he came along to tell me all about this about 10 days ago, and so I said, right, I've got to go and do that. And there are two simple reasons why I wanted to come along today. First of all, there is money at stake here, money potentially for the West Midlands economy, and secondly, I wanted just to reiterate, and I hope in a sense it didn't need doing, my support for your sector and just how important this sector is to the West Midlands future. There is £80 million on the table. That's the sort of tough, rather grubby part of the day's proceedings, and you're going to hear a bit more about exactly how that money will be opened up through the Creative Industries Cluster programme. But of course it is, as we've just heard from Anthony, part of that wider government approach to industrial strategy. And I've just been at Conservative Party conference for the last 3 days. You deserve a survivor's medal for that, frankly. But the interesting thing was, so many of the speakers talked, or the cabinet ministers who spoke, talked about the primacy of the industrial strategy. Personally, I welcome it hugely, because this government is now saying, let's think about what each region of the country really can be famous for. What's it good at? And frankly, what we're good at in the West Midlands is different to what the North West is good at, different to what the North East is good at. And let's make sure we invest behind those capabilities. So this is part of a much bigger and frankly very significant and very welcome approach to driving our industries of the future. Just if I get you to think about two of the other parts of this challenge fund, we're already bidding as the West Midlands very substantial bids into what they call the Faraday Challenge for the future of electric vehicle production, and indeed a separate bidding into what the autonomous vehicle production will be like in the future. And that just seems very natural that the West Midlands should lead that. Frankly, if we don't get the lion's share of that funding, I should be on the phone to Greg Clark, a disgusted Birmingham. And we're also bidding, again with the support of Birmingham University, into the Life Sciences Fund. I don't think they found a sexy name for that yet, but again, we think that we would naturally bid into that. But the thought today is obviously that the Creative Industries Fund should be just as much a natural association with the West Midlands as those two that we would, almost automatically think. Why is that? Simply because the creative industries have to be at the heart of our economic future. Back right to the LEP days, and I chaired the Greater Birmingham and Solihull LEP, and then through the WMCA's Strategic Economic Plan. Sounds like a load of bureaucracy that, but it is important because that's about where we're putting our chips on the table. And we're very, very clear that creative industries are at the heart of that economic plan. Why? 5 reasons probably. They're the fastest growing sector of the economy, and obviously you've got to do well in the fastest growing for you to do well overall. They do drive innovation. It's very clear. It's not a sector that's limited. It's innovation. It drives high quality, high paid jobs of the future. And one of the things I am really pleased with about this region now after years of underperformance, you can see the advent of more high paid jobs, and that's why this region had the fastest growth of pay of any region in the country last year. The creative industry is also at the interface with other industries. It's not sort of, as I say, bounded. It's very much at that interface that ingenuity really comes through to create new businesses. And as we've already heard, Peter Bazalgette summed it up incredibly well, that the sort of creative and cultural revival really does go hand in glove with the economic revival. So I'm absolutely clear, it's core to our futures. The good news is we've got a good record in this sector, but if I'm honest, it's not good enough, despite the efforts of everyone in this room. So yes, it's the fastest growing sector in the UK, about 3 times the rate of growth of the rest of the economy, and over the last 5 years, the West Midlands has grown faster than the national average in this area. We've got the second biggest digital cluster outside London, twice the scale of Greater Manchester actually in digital industries, despite the fact people might not naturally think that. And we know that over half of the startups in the West Midlands are in this digital and creative space. So we've got a good record, but it's not good enough. It's not genuinely world-beating yet, and that's why this type of opportunity is so important to us. In terms of what we're doing already, we had the launch of the Creative Industries Council and their toolkit here just about 3 weeks ago. We were able to announce that day a 2.1 million fund for film production and the Screen Bureau coming back. It's not huge sums of money, but at least it does actually give some support to that critical sector now. And what we've also done, taking a longer-term view of it, if you think of the BBC story, we have managed to get more BBC investment here. May not be the commissioning that we'd want, but if you think of what we did to get BBC 3 digital here, that too was a good move forward. The Commonwealth Games success, and we're very, very near to that being confirmed. Okay, it's predominantly about sport, but there's a huge cultural element of it as well, and I know for certain that our prowess in that really, really did catch the judge's view. And of the £500 million of government money that will be invested here to do that, obviously some of it will be supporting, again, to this question of the boundaries of the creative sector. We've got to win the Coventry City of Culture label. That final bid went in on Friday. And of course, the judging will be concluded the beginning of December. And that probably is worth about £120 million of investment if we can pull that one off. And the big one, which you probably know I'm slightly obsessed with, is bringing Channel 4 here. No one's clear what the bidding process is for that. It's completely opaque. I think it's actually see who you can nudge on the shoulder in the corridors of power in Westminster and Whitehall. But we are very determined to bring that success here because I see all these iconic investments as sort of supporters to what I would describe as a very dynamic, indeed slightly anarchic, if I can describe it in that way, in the positive sense of the word, anarchic industry that genuinely brings about innovation. So we're well placed, but this is an opportunity that frankly we could not let pass by. And if you look at the sort of terms for this competition, I think they're actually perfectly written for us to thrive. They require a university to be the lead anchor institution, and in the University of Birmingham and David Eastwood's leadership of that, we have got a brilliant head start. And then it requires leverage and matching from the private sector, which many of you will bring. So I'm very confident that this is a competition that we can genuinely perform incredibly well in. And that would be another success story for the West Midlands as we try to build this all-important industry. So that's all I would say. Hope it's encouraging, upbeat, and then I'm going to pass to David to reveal his belief in this sector and the role that the university already plays and will play to bring home success in this competition. David, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure that's a very encouraging speech to hear in the room. Far be it from me to say there are more universities are available. But I know they are, and there could be alternatives and clusters and all sorts of other bits, but I don't like stealing David's thunder. It never goes well. So coming up to give a view from the University of Birmingham, it's David Eastwood. Thank you.
Anthony, thanks very much indeed. I don't perform with children, I don't perform with animals, and if I can avoid it, I don't follow Andy Street. Andy Street talked to the HEFGE annual conference about 3 years ago wearing his LEP hat. Brilliant exposition, one of the best expositions I've heard about the relationship between universities and economic growth. A number of my Vice-Chancellor colleagues came up to me afterwards and said, it must be really easy to run a university in Birmingham because you've got Andy Street. So, but Andy, your support is enormously welcomed, enormously important, and I know is absolutely heartfelt and central to the agendas that you are leading as our new Metro Mayor. I'm here really wearing 3 hats. I'm a council member of the AHRC, and I'm absolutely committed to the success of this programme. I've seen the remarkable work that Andy Thompson has done that Anthony has done in persuading government that the creative sector must and should be a part of its industrial strategy. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We are now playing, I think, for very high stakes. So as a council member of AHRC, I'm absolutely committed to the success of this programme. And some of you will remember I was the chief executive of the predecessor body, the AHRB. And so I have a real sense of the distance travelled, the battles fought, the battles won, and the opportunities in front of us. I'm also the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, hugely proud to be Vice-Chancellor of that great institution, a university with 3 museums, 2 concert halls, and about to create at the heart of the university the largest enclosed space in any global university, which will be a centre for installation art, for outdoor performance. So we're a university which has that intersection with creativity and the creative industries at our heart. And finally, I'm here as a failed violinist. The rest of my career was built on that failure when I realised at the age of 16 that I wasn't quite good enough. So, Andy and Anthony have set the scene. The creative industries are critically important in and of themselves, but they have that wider importance as a sector of the economy which is growing dynamically. 10% of all UK exports. Isn't it interesting that the creative industries and higher education are 2 of the globally most significant sectors in terms of driving exports and driving enhanced GVA? And as Andy said, in the complex economy of the West Midlands, an economy which is really interesting because we are still rooted in the history of places like this, places where we made things. We are the principal centre now for the inward investment of the financial and professional services industry. This is a hugely dynamic economy. But creativity and the creative industries and the kind of clustering that we are seeing is the harbinger, I think, of that kind of new series of economic alliances that in different ways both Anthony and Andy spoke to. And one of the things I think we have to do is we have to break out from a notion that the creative industries are somehow clustered. We're in some sort of redoubt, as Anthony said in his opening remarks. The permeability, the way in which the creative sector interacts with myriad other parts of the economy is critical to our future. So we continue to see the way in which right across the geography of this region, creative industries, large, small, SMEs, mega cultural institutions are driving, shaping and reshaping the economy of our region. Take, for example, the success of the video games industry in Leamington Spa. 50 active businesses, over 400 million of outputs generated, and working in partnership with the University of Warwick and the University of Coventry. That kind of synergy, often between small seeding creatives and the capabilities of universities, often very generously given. Well, we're down in that part of the country. I was in Stratford yesterday for the meeting of my University Council. We have a partnership with the Royal Shakespeare Company. We had the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford since 1951, and we are an investor in the other place in Stratford as the RSC reopened that. Last World Shakespeare Congress, run jointly by us and the RSC, 800 writers and performers from 48 countries around the world to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. Last year I was in China signing off various agreements, and they ran from the South China grid, which services 239 million people. You always have to get your head around different numbers in China, through to signing off an agreement with Phoenix Publishing, the largest publisher in China, where we and the RSC work with them to bring Shakespeare to China. So there you get it, a Midlands institution working with another Midlands institution, the RSC, reaching out to China. So we can continue to talk about these examples and build a narrative of success. But as Andy has just said, that's the basis on which we build. That should give us confidence. It should give us confidence in the context of the creative clusters call. But this is a highly competitive market. It's a market where you've actually got to get the chemistry right. You've got to get the interactions right. So at the heart of this call is a primacy, actually, accorded to the way in which the lead universities will work with the businesses, will work with the industry, the way in which ideas will be translated into projects, the way in which projects will be translated into SMEs. So this is a moment where if we can get this right, if we can build on what we have, if we can proceed confidently, I believe that we can be a trailblazer within the Creative Clusters programme. So as we stand here, is it on the cusp? The announcement has been made, the money has been secured, the roadshows are underway. What is going to happen next? What do we need to do next to make this work? And here I think we have to have a moment where we pause and realise that the stakes are high. When we were discussing with government, when we were advocating with government, when we were fighting battles with government for this funding, not everybody yet gets it. Not everybody yet understands the centrality of the creative industries, not just to the economy, but to the kind of society we are, the kind of country we are, the well-being of our future citizens. And we have here something that's really precious. I mean, to go back to China, and I spend quite a lot of time in China, and I'm often taken on one side by other university leaders and by political leaders in China, saying, how do you teach creativity in the UK? They have a real sense that it is something that we are much better at than them. They see the economic value that comes from creativity, they see the social value that comes from creativity, and when they're talking to a university leader, they think it's something in our curriculum that does it. Now, there are things in our curriculum, there are things in our style of teaching, there are things in the culture of universities which help nurture creativity. But you don't teach creativity. Creativity is something that happens. It's something that happens in those kind of ineffable spaces that we create. It's something that happens in the collision of ideas. It's something that happens from the ingenuity and the ambition of people. So we have here something that is precious, something that is delicate, something that should be nurtured. And something, I think, that this programme that AHRC, in an inspired way, is leading, can move us from where we are, which is in a leading position, to a position where the creative industries in this country will stand unassailable. So the stakes are high. If we succeed, then there is, I think, a major transformation that we will contribute to. If we fail, then we will never have credibility with government again when we're trying to make the argument. We are already beginning to have the follow-on funding discussions. Make no mistake about that. But if this doesn't succeed, if we cannot show government in the early stages of this programme, it's not actually about the 3- and 5-year reports that you will write. It's actually in the first year, the first 18 months, we have to show that the programme is working. We have to show that the rubber is hitting the road. Because if we don't do that, then the follow-on funding won't be there. But the case that we have made will be seen as being hollow. So what do we need to do? Firstly, I think we need to work together to deliver the skills, the entrepreneurship, the professional development, which is essential to underpinning a thriving creative economy. We have to demonstrate through the complex structures of the creative industries, that we are growing opportunities, that we are developing jobs, and that we are developing those jobs which actually are in some ways exactly the kind of jobs that the economy needs, jobs which are around people, jobs which reward well, back to Andy's point, and jobs actually which animate and give confidence to the society of which we are a part. And there is a really important skills underpinning to that, and I think any of the bids that will succeed in this programme will address that, not in a very traditional way, but address the skills challenge in a way which is appropriate to the creative sector. Secondly, I think we will need through this programme to demonstrate the permeability between universities and the industry, the way in which universities have a track record of supporting the industry. It was interesting in this city yesterday that the CBSO, one of the great institutions of the city, announced its support for a music school in the Black Country. Fabulous, fabulous initiative, taking elite culture, dreadful term, to a part of the West Midlands where you wouldn't do it. What's bold about that is it's not a music school in Edgbaston where my university is. And that's the kind of thinking, I think, that we need to accelerate. My own university, for the last 6 years, has been funding a cultural internship scheme. We fund cultural interns each year, half a dozen, 8 of them, to work in the leading cultural institutions of this city. So, we have about 60 now people working in the cultural industry who come through that cultural internship program, using our resource to help drive the creative industries. We also, I think, need to develop a way of talking to one another, languages that enable us to work together, languages that enable us in the university sector to speak of our research, to frame our research in terms which are not just self-referential, which don't just speak to us and to our agendas, but positively embrace, listen to, work with, and communicate with our colleagues in the creative sector. I also think we need to start to think about what we think the infrastructure of the creative industries will be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. This is not a sector that can be engineered. This is not a sector where Whitehall can determine the shape of the sector. Creativity has its own intrinsic, wonderfully productive anarchy. And if we rob the creative sector of that, we take away its lifeblood, we take away its fundamental energy. On the other hand, if we don't put an appropriate loose framework around this, if we don't find still better ways of working together, if we don't, as Anthony was hinting at in his opening remark, think about the way in which creativity and its supply chains work, if we don't facilitate that, then we will end up with suboptimal outcomes. So thinking about human capital, thinking about the supply chain, thinking about delivery should not be rebarbative. We might need to recast the language that we use, but these are important tools, I think, to promoting success. So for me, for my university, working in partnership to try to frame an appropriate bid is something which for us is an urgent priority. One of the characteristics, I think, of this part of the country is that we do work better together than many other areas. Just to speak of the universities, if I might for a moment, we are the only part of the country which still has a functioning regional association of universities where we get together. On Monday night, Andy was with all of the vice-chancellors from the combined authorities, from the 8 institutions which are part of the geography of the new combined authority. That's a pattern of ways of working in higher education. But also there are other partnerships in the cities of the West Midlands, which actually the local enterprise partnerships have been pivotal over the last 5 or 6 years in enhancing. We talk about common endeavours in a way which is not necessarily characteristic of some of the other areas of the country. And here, I think, in the West Midlands, we also have a strong sense, which again is not mirrored elsewhere, but I won't mention any other geographies, of success being something which is shared. And if success is shared, then success is usually greater. So I think in framing our response to this call, we need to build on those patterns of collaborative working, that imperative that we need to contribute to something which is greater, which is the success here of the region of which we are part. So it's an exciting moment, it's an important moment, it's a challenge to which we need to rise. And I want to leave you with a thought from one of the great figures of the 20th century, possibly the greatest conductor of the 20th century, Leonard Bernstein, who is reputed to have said, "To achieve great things, 2 things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time." That's where we are, and we will succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Andy. I know Andy has to leave us shortly, but thanks again for joining us. David, we were a bit ahead of time, which is something I've literally never said as chair of a conference. Perhaps we could have a little discussion about some of those topics and any Q&A from the floor. We're just going to lapel mic you up fairly quickly. I thought it was really fascinating contribution from both speakers this morning. I'm going to just explore a little bit. Come take a seat, David. Just going to explore a little bit some of those questions about language and about partnership and about how to work together effectively, because I think they're going to be really central to this. I'll just ask David a couple of questions. Will see how we go. We'll break for coffee in a little while. But thanks again, Andy, if you have to leave. That's great. Nice to see you. I'm going to sit right next to you. It's sort of basic rules. I'm going to sit one away, so it's a loose play. So you've said lots of very interesting things there. Let's just focus a little bit on how you build partnerships and and the specific challenges of higher education and industry working together. So I don't mean specifically in the creative industries, but in other areas you've worked in where it's been successful, or probably more interestingly where it's been problematic. Yeah. How does partnership building actually work in practice? Because what I know this isn't, it's not you cannot win this bid, I don't think, with a partnership that's based on carving up the money, or the geography, or who you think should get the money. Yeah. We're going to be held to account on whether it works. Yeah. So from what you know of other areas and your great experience of this, where are the kind of golden rules and the pitfalls?
Okay, I think actually, the premise is absolutely right. We've got a lot to learn from the way in which partnerships work in other sectors. I think the first rule is if the parties come together with rent-seeking behaviours, it will fail.
So not just about money?
So not just about money, not just about what I can get out of it, what my institution can get out of it, but actually thinking about the totality. So it is a classic, you can make the whole more than the sum of its parts. So that's about pooling ambition. And it's also about recognising that actually what you're trying to create here is a partnership rather than just a funding stream.
And that's going to be a claritative objective then?
Absolutely. And often it's only in the second and third meeting that you start to discover that you thought you were all on the same page in the first meeting. So I think having the honest discussions to understand where the parties are coming from is critical. The third thing I think is recognising, and it's the inverse of the rent-seeking behaviour, that we all have to bring things to the table. Okay. They might be things in kind, they might be matching resource, but to open up those discussions early on. Because the worst kinds of partners are the partners who stay in the conversation until the 11th hour and then, broadly speaking, say we're not playing by that rule.
Okay.
So we're not prepared to put resource in, we're not prepared to put real time in, we're here only for what we can get out of it. I'm also struck by, if I think about our big industrial partnerships, it's what you end up talking about. You need a high level of trust. So, our major industrial partnership is with Rolls-Royce.
Okay.
So £60 million facility out at Coventry, really around the next generation of turbines. Now, what is really interesting about that is the R&D challenge is a 10-year challenge. And it's business critical to them. It's not the only thing that's business critical to them, but they have outsourced to colleagues in my university a critical part of their business. And if we get it right, they have a major commercial advantage. If we don't, then their share price will take a very big hit. So what that tells you is it's about the ability to share what the challenges are. Now, you've got to create trust, you've got to create a safe space, and you've got to find ways of listening in that space.
And that's a very applied challenge with presumably some really deep theoretical problems.
Correct. Yes.
Involved in it. So why don't Rolls-Royce just buy that capability internally? What's special about their relationship to an HEI and the kind of people and the way an HEI works that we could think about replicating here?
I think actually one of the things that characterises, our relationship between an organisation like Rolls and an organisation like the University of Birmingham, is we are a bit more chaotic than they are. They're a highly structured organisation.
As a frequent flyer, I'm glad to hear that.
And exactly, you really don't want. Actually, just when I was relatively new in this role here, I was talking to a main board member at Rolls, and I said, look, I do get it. They were about to invest 60 million in the university. I said, look, I get it. If we don't deliver, you'll go shopping for another partner. And he said, no, David, you really don't get it. If you don't deliver, planes will fall out of the air. Right. Now, I am pretty sure that their quality assurance is
it's a bit better than that.
but it did speak to me in a very powerful way to the level of trust. But
right.
But universities are places where the development of ideas is non-linear. You give us a problem, we'll work the problem in different ways. We have a massive interdisciplinary capability when we need to draw on that. So we're quite different from a big corporate in that sense. Now, we could, as we're talking about the interrelationship with the creative industries, we can say the creative industries are messier still than universities. But nevertheless, I think that's part of the reason that sectors come to universities. We have a capability, we have a massive resource that we can draw on. We are driven by curiosity. I mean, that's what gets my colleagues up in the morning. These are deeply curious people, and it's their curiosity that makes them creative, whether they're doing powder fabrication, Shakespeare, or thinking of new therapies to intervene in the health sphere. So one of the things that we need to do optimally here is to harness that kind of curiosity, which is fundamental to universities, in a way that delivers to the creative agenda.
So I'm going to put the devil's advocate head on for a minute. Aren't academics mostly interested in the theory? Aren't academics in disciplines which they don't necessarily cross out of very easily? Isn't the whole idea, you've heard me do this talk at the council, the whole idea of interdisciplinary is a sort of cop-out on an anti-disciplinary view of the world where you actually just solve the problem that's in front of you? Aren't universities extraordinarily bureaucratic and slow-moving? I mean, how do we overcome the truth, the grain of truth in at least some of those statements? All of those statements?
Actually, the last is very interesting. I mean, particularly if you're dealing with big corporates. Big corporates move more slowly now than some universities. So we've understood the challenge and we've turned it around.
But we mostly won't be in this section, of course.
No, but there's nothing worth doing in a university you can't do in 48 hours, really. I mean, if you want to sign it off.
If you're VC.
Yeah. But that's actually quite an important point to this call, that this really matters. It might not be the biggest money that's being routed through the university, but for the sector and for the politics of the sector, as I was trying to say in my remarks, this really matters. So you've got to have the buy-in at the appropriate level of the university, and if you don't have that, and if you can't break a few eggs, if you can't shortcut a few processes from the top, then we're not doing here what I would do in other spheres. So that's important. I think the central point you make, which was aren't academics just interested in 4-star outputs for the ref? I think that misses a really important point, which is most academics spend at least half their time, often more than half their time, in teaching and teaching-related activities, which is very different.
Sure.
Which is about it's about the challenge of knowledge. It's about presenting knowledge. It's about fostering the way in which students learn and indeed become creative. So I think when we're talking about the creative industries, we're not just talking about the research side of the university, but we're talking about the totality of what we do. And then, the truth is that some of my colleagues are only interested in basic research. Some of my colleagues are passionate about what in other spheres we would call translational research, but research that has impact. And the genius of the management of the university ought to be to make that work together. So, we don't suggest that everybody who works in our medical school is engaged in translational medicine. Some of them are at the bench doing bench research, which may or may not make the breakthrough discovery. So that just speaks out to the organisation of people within universities. In a university that you might think is quite traditional like mine, increasingly people talk about their disciplines in terms of the problems that they are engaged with. And it's very often, particularly in areas of arts and humanities, it's very often the creative challenges that bring people together. Digital humanities being just one example.
A key point, yeah, absolutely. So, I know that you've pushed very hard for that whole point about senior people taking this seriously within universities, and in fact, making sure that the requirement on universities was sufficiently big so that they would pay attention to the creative industries in the way they might to other sectors. And I think that's been a really key driver in the formulation of this programme. I'm going to use that as a sort of blunt segue into the question of leadership. So within the call documents, those of you who've seen them, you may or may not quite have picked up what we're saying about the director of a cluster, and the fact that the director of a cluster is not necessarily a traditional academic PI with a publications list as long as their arm. That they could, in fact, be the opposite of that. They could be an industry person, they could be a broker sort of person. How do you feel that? How do you feel a university can approach that? To me, it seems the easiest thing is to pick the person who you already know, who's most likely to do that job well, and not necessarily to go looking outside. Is that a risk for a bid, do you think?
I think that's a good question, and I think there may be a transitional moment where we're talking about the leadership of the bid and the shaping of the bid, and given the timescales that we have, they really do need to be known quantities. They need to be people who are familiar with working in the broad space that we're operating in. But then, at a later stage in the process, who might the most appropriate director be? That could well be a different question, and best answered when the shape of the bid is starting to come together. But one of the things I didn't say in the speech, because I cut it out, because I wasn't actually reading the speech I was given, but it's the BAU point. If all we do is we try and repurpose existing collaborations for this call, then those bids will fail. I hope I'm not giving away, the sort of peer review secrets here. But I think the people who are leading this process are very clear that what we have to do to be credible here is bespoke. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we don't exploit and build on patterns of collaboration we already have. But this is not a bid which is this is not a call where if you can tick the box and one bid has 6, one bid has 8, and one bid has 10 HEIs in, the third bid wins because it has 10 HEIs.
I would say quite the opposite.
And I'm sure you're right. And similarly, a kind of catch-all that says, oh well, okay, we will bring in every representative of the creative sector in a particular geography that raises its hand, then you'll end up with a string bag that really doesn't work. I think it's long enough to tell the story. I mean, my university, just before I arrived, failed to get an academic health science centre because we put in a bid that had 13 health partners in it. And we were up against bids where it was 2, 3 and 4. And they had a coherence, and we said this is one big happy family, and it turned out to be one big, quite fractious family. Yeah. So, that's always stayed with me. That I think the engineering of the bids needs to be an engineering of the bids around purpose and around partnerships. Yeah. For this bid, rather than partnerships that pre-exist.
So that's the underpinning rationale for the challenge focus. I think Andrew Chitty will talk about it in a moment, but the challenge focus of the bid, apart from the fact that that's quite voguish in public policy at the moment and in sort of funding councils in general, the question mark at the end of the challenge has to be something that is actually capable of being answered. Or at least you can suggest you're directing yourselves towards that. But that doesn't mean, however, that big sort of contextual factors are not relevant. You talked a great deal and very eloquently about relationships to music and what the CBSO are doing with schools, etc. A number of these events have found themselves in the sort of STEM and STEAM debate to some degree. Yeah. Now, we can't change Michael Gove's previous policy in the national curriculum, etc., and the EBAC and those things. But we do clearly understand, I think, in terms of the way this call has been constructed, that because the clusters have to be existing, and that's a variable in its own right, that term, but they've got to be existing. That means they have a history, they have a present, and they have a future in their location. So, if you aren't embedded in a way that you're engaged with the skills needs of the region or the city or the sector, and you haven't historically been that, and you aren't talking about the role of higher research skills in the creative industries more generally, and the skills that may be developed in your undergraduate teaching and your relationship to schools, they're probably not going to be scoring points, but they're contextually important, it seems to me.
Yes.
And are they not part of the civic role of a university, full stop?
Absolutely. I think what you just said is really interesting and really important. And actually, in some senses, it's a note to selves, given that we're both on the AHRC Council. Because in order to win the funding, you have to talk a certain kind of language. Sure. And in order to demonstrate the validity of the funding, you need to have outputs and you need to have metrics which reinforces that. But it is really important that this isn't reductionist. And it's really important that there is a kind of multiplier outside of the hub in terms of other things that the players are doing. But, if we just say, in the end, this is about economic benefit, if we just say this is about jobs created, if we don't say, actually, this is about the kind of society we are, the kind of people we are, the kind of hope that we give, that's important in a region such as this, we will have lost something really important. Now, those things are a bit more ineffable. They're certainly not amenable of the kind of simple metrics that financial reporting requires. Yeah. But I think, and that's why I think it's a note to selves, to us as council members, that we need this to succeed. And I was urgent about that in what I said earlier. We need it to succeed because it's an important sector of the economy, but we need to do it to succeed because it's critical to the kind of country that we are going to be.
Yes. And so I think, just to close then, I think that's really important contribution. There's been a sort of tendency, a couple of these meetings, to occasionally for there to appear to be a sort of false duality or false dichotomy between the cultural value, the sort of civic and regeneration component, and this kind of rather directed growth and economic development sort of piece of the particular application of this fund. You know, we know, you and I know, the HRC Council, the HRC Royal Charter requires us to look at cultural and social aspects of the nation and the higher education's role in those things. That's a necessary and it's a kind of embedded condition of why we're doing this piece of work. But the success criteria, it cannot be that alone. It cannot be the cultural value piece alone. And I think that should, hopefully that's reasonably clear. But also, I've not really met anybody with a sophisticated understanding of this, which means outside HM Treasury, who doesn't know that that's the real world. That is just how the creative industries work. Of course they are implicitly cultural and economic. That's sort of clues in the name. And so it's only really the odd, rather dry theoretical economist in HMT who doesn't see that. And even then they really do, because usually they were a failed violinist or something. but you know, somewhere in there is that kind of false dichotomy. Well, look, that was brilliant of you to just come on an impromptu panel as well. We're going to break for coffee. And
can I just say, you guys don't know how hard it is to sit here being asked questions by him, who knows much more about this than I do. So thank you for the viva.
How are we going to score him? What do you think? I'm going to do a sort of bottom-up peer review. We'll see what you get. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing it. Thanks for coming.
And thank you all.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, everybody. Great start from Anthony and Andy and David Eastwood. I now get to do what could otherwise be the quite boring bit of actually talking through the briefing of what the call's about. But I don't want to make it boring, so I want to make it, we want a lot of energy. We had our first launch in London, we decided was a bit low-key. And there's people from all over the country, they didn't know each other well, they couldn't argue with each other, they didn't really know what a cluster was. And so we don't expect that from a community in the Midlands. So we want to make this, we'll take this through fairly fast. There'll be some messages we're delivering which will echo some of the things we've heard earlier. There'll be some messages that will be repeated so many times that you might get that we're serious about them. We'll make sure there's enough time for Q&A at the end. Obviously, there's a bid writing session after lunch for more technical questions. We'll handle the questions at the end. I'll be joined on stage by Dylan Law, who's the Programme Manager for this, working with us in the AHRC, and Julie McLaren, who's at the back, will also be offering wise words. But let's start off by talking a bit about clusters. So I'm going to talk about what we mean by clusters a little bit before we then go and talk about the other aspects of the programme. So, okay, so what we've heard so far is the context for this is the industrial strategy, and specifically the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. Now, I know that's been said before, but it's really, really important, particularly for those coming from the research community, that this is not normal Research Council money. It's not normal AHRC money. Now, the good news on that is it isn't being directed to this programme at the expense of any other AHRC Arts and Humanities funded research. This is distinct money, but it obviously, because it's in the context of the industrial strategy and coming down through bays, it has strings attached. The strings attached being we actually have to do some things that have impact, and it has to be an industry research collaboration. And I'll say, before Gary at the front prompts me, as I asked him to do, when I say industry and creative industries, it's really important that some of us have spent too long inside government in these discussions. And so we could come out here and you could think creative industries, what about cultural industries? We see creative industries and cultural industries, we use creative industries as a shorthand for both, because it means in those rather more economic dialogues, we don't suffer people then trying to cut them apart and say, oh, we want to fund the industry bit, we don't want to fund the culture bit. So cultural and creative industries, I find a bit kind of slow to say. So that's what I mean. So with the industrial strategy, what we've seen so far is, as people have said, and some of this money is landing in the Midlands, which I understand to mean the West Midlands and the East Midlands. I was born in Leicester, worked a lot in Birmingham, lived in Stafford. So I do vaguely know some of the geography, and the East Midlands indeed does exist. So some of this money has already landed around the country, but the first set of announcements were what you might call traditional industrial R&D sectors. So various bits of the automotive industry, whether it's batteries or autonomous vehicles. There was an award made around autonomous vehicles for dangerous environments. So we think of the North Sea, kind of gas and oil sector, and there's been announcements around the pharma sector as well. So these are big classic industrial R&D heavy sectors. The industrial strategy and the industrial strategy challenge fund money is being used to support their continued engagement and development in the UK, but not much until this point for the creative industries. So when last Friday, Greg Clark stood up at the Bazalgette review and announced this programme. So it's an interesting piece of choreography. That Baz review obviously features the broadest definition of clusters as probably its most significant point, and this programme's been positioned as part of a government response to Bazalgette. Now, obviously, we didn't actually just make it all up in the last 8 days. So what we are is we're being positioned as a down payment on that increased emphasis on clusters as the industrial strategy for the creative industries. But what we are is a very, very focused part of that. We are not a pilot for the recommendations of the Bazalgette review. What this is about is identifying within existing clusters where an R&D investment could make a difference. So it's not an investment across all the activities of the cluster. But nevertheless, it's a very, very important moment because, as people have said before, this is the first time this kind of money has been used in the context of the creative industries. So we're all used to making the arguments about the creative industries as an important sector of the economy. And, nice snazzy graphics from the Creative Industries Council, the fact that creative industries are growing faster than other sectors, the fact that they're increasing contribution to exports. That argument is well accepted and understood, I would say, these days within government. So we've convinced people that the sector is important, but have we convinced people that research and development investment or innovation investment in the sector is important? I would say up until this point, and certainly my experience coming in from the creative sector, was that this argument has not been won. And that's why this programme is so important, because it's the first time we've actually convinced them to see the creative industries with an R&D requirement and a need on the same level with those other more traditional sectors. So as John McVeigh said when opening at the London event, so John McVeigh, Creative Industries Council, Chief Executive of PACT, said, that's what makes this so important, that we don't cock it up, because otherwise we won't get any money again. So, clusters seems to be the vehicle that people are talking. Lots of different strands of work have come together to say as the locus for an investment in the creative sector and in R&D. So we take clusters. Obviously, we're looking at some of the work that's preceded us. Some of it you'll all be familiar with. That's Dave. I see David smiling there, because obviously for the LEPs, the economic geography of this piece is very important. So starting off with the Creative England Nesta work from 18 months ago, geography of creativity in the UK, with people like Tech Nation looking at the digital sector. We've become rather used to seeing various kinds of maps of the UK with various kinds of areas identified as clusters with an over-preponderance of the creative industries. So I think along with Baz, we're happy to kind of take what we mean as clusters as having, based on the kind of Nesta definition, so a geographical concentration, not only of businesses, but of workers. So there's a workforce that within clusters, they're not just businesses and workforce who happen to be in the same place. They're embedded in value chains. There's a level of collaboration and a level of competition involved as well. The other thing that Nesta identify is the importance of other institutions. So obviously the HEIs, but the cultural institutions as well. So clusters, cultural institutions have a very strong impact and networking effect within a cluster, but so do trade associations, whether national or cluster-based, these intermediate associations, and government bodies, to which we think of the economic bodies, whether it be LEPs or the development agencies in Scotland, or local government. So there's more to a cluster than just the businesses and the people. We also recognise that the clusters do come in different sizes and configurations, and that there are other things that articulate them, particularly hubs, co-working spaces, and things like that. So there's a different sizes and shapes to clusters, although it has to be said, this is one of these repeated messages, that this investment is about investing in R&D in established clusters. This is not a cluster building exercise. And to be honest, that's a pragmatic choice, that with a limited amount of investment and a very high consequence of failure, we want to give this our best shot. So if we want to see the impact of increasing investment in R&D, we want to place that investment in the places that are most likely to deliver the impact. So clusters that are already established seem the best place. So one of the things is, so where are these clusters? So as Anthony said right at the start, there's a bottom-up and top-down element to this, and we're trying to keep the bottom-up as strongly as possible. So to a degree, we want everybody bidding into this to describe the cluster of which the bid is a part and describe its strengths and characteristics. We're not going to top-down say where they are. But one thing we have done, and we will be releasing this, it will probably be next week now, because these we've only just got the data, is we've asked Leicester to recut it's a combination of the Geography of Creativity and the forthcoming Creative Nation data by subsector. So this is the map that you'll be commonly see, so travel to work areas and red's hot, blue's cold. That's the creative industries in the UK. But what we've asked Juan and Hassan to do for us is recut that by subsector. And please use this data. It will be on the CE programme website, and we'll release it as raw data as well as any maps. So it's just so that you can actually use some external reference, and it's a little bit more granular, though not as granular as you'd like, probably, so that you can look at the specific sectors that you'll be perhaps putting forward as strengths of your own in the bid. So this is, so some of these maps very much resemble the overall UK map. So this is film, TV, radio and photography. So it shows the same kind of southeast English, Anglo-centric bias with a little bit of central belt in Scotland that you'd see on the aggregate data. So just to orient you, on the left it's measured by businesses, on the right by employment. But if you look at architecture, for instance, key UK creative sector, it's much more diffuse, and it represents some of the areas that have the highest proportion of employment, although obviously small, are not in the metro regions. If you look at craft, you get a much more pronounced effect there, and certainly in terms of employment, for those who are interested in peripheral or rural or distributed clusters, obviously craft becomes one of the places that you can make that argument, and I'm sure there are people in Inverness even now preparing such an argument in Scotland. And museums, galleries and libraries is very, very evenly spread, and it's an interesting thing about the employment data there, that it actually drops out some of the heavy southeast focus that you expect from the creative industries entirely. So we'll put these up. It is quite granular data, so it's all the travel to work areas and all the DCMS subsectors. So we hope this will prove useful. It may or may not. Here's some that we've just picked out where we can blow it up, so you can go into this data as well. So music, performing arts, visual arts has its own distribution and publishing. Again, a kind of distinctive pattern, and you'll be able to use that data hopefully when you're putting together bids. Obviously, it also gives us and the Policy and Evidence Centre, that's part of the larger programme, the start of a baseline of evidence as well. So it gives us the chance of saying, if you are a bid, say, saying, and at this point names are invidious, but if you're saying, in location X we have a fantastic cluster of this, will be, and none of the data suggests that's true, we might expect a higher level of evidence to persuade us that that's the case. So it's just hopefully useful on both sides. Just want to end this little bit on clusters, thinking about some of the things that Baz suggested were the prize for supporting creative clusters. So providing a stimulus to regional growth, so I think we all agree with that, and the wider set of recommendations that Baz makes, I think, and the conversations going on now about how do you find that £500 million pot to direct towards a wider clusters programme. The idea that that's the purpose, the prime purpose is stimulating regional growth seems reasonable. Improving productivity through increasing the density or growing and scaling businesses within the cluster. So these are the business dynamics. So that, again, seems a very worthwhile and achievable aim, though probably not the primary aim of this programme. Obviously, alignment with finance, access to investment of these research and development partners is a key thing for us, but it's the alignment rather than necessarily the delivery. But the third one of those that Baz identifies, developing a tailored talent and R&D pipeline for local areas by forging stronger links between education and industry, is obviously, that's, I think, where we would see the core of this proposition. So the interaction between talent and R&D pipeline, HEIs and industry, is one that you'll all be trying to articulate in bids. So, turning a bit to the programme. And I'm just going to check with time. Am I doing all right for time or not? Let's go. All right, good, great. Okay, so what's the programme going to do? So some of this will be a bit repetitive, but repetition is sometimes deliberate. Growing the creative industries through driving growth in R&D and new products, services and experiences. I'll come back to that in a second. Creating a robust creative R&D infrastructure. So this is an interesting thing. Have we got a creative R&D infrastructure at the moment? Is this part of building it? So if you asked if we had a robust medical research infrastructure for the UK, you'd have hundreds of people, including quite a few of them in the House of Lords, stand up and say, yes, we do. But this is perhaps the start of building that robust creative R&D infrastructure. And we've got £51 million of new funding. I think Anthony referred to earlier on about how we get to £80 million, and we'd explain that at some point. I think it's more of an emergent property throughout the day. So we've got that £51 million to 8 creative R&D partnerships and 1 Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. I'm not really going to talk about that because it's a different process, a different competition which people will become involved in. But the idea is to create an independent observatory for data around the creative industries for the UK, which is something that policymakers and the industry and the research community, I think, have needed for a long time, because a lot of data comes from a position of advocacy rather than necessarily true independence. So we've said about the opportunities that we've identified in the core documents that there are a series of challenges faced by creative businesses. So whether it's around collaboration or networks or value chains, or around new business models and IP, my personal opinion is new business models are possibly more interesting and more important than IP, but that people may disagree with that. There's challenges around investment and access to finance and ladders of investment and risk. There's issues around skills, there's issues around how do we promote greater global connectivity and greater global exports, and there's key issues within the sector around equality and diversity, and particularly around access. And that feeds into talent pipeline, and within a city, metro, region kind of context, one can think of ways this programme could address some of those things. But primus inter pares of all of these is product and service innovation. So this is classic core R&D. It's about how do we develop the great new stuff, the new experiences, how does R&D contribute to that we can build economic growth, jobs and opportunities on the back of. So we're not going to make any apologies that we see as the prime. The other considerations are very, very important, and you'll want to articulate the different emphasis on those in your own bids. So what are we trying to do? The aims are to, and I've said it again, enhancing existing creative clusters. So the state, knowing what your cluster is, and what it does, what it can do, what it could do, is key to this, and leveraging existing assets. So whether they are cultural institutions, whether they are higher education institutions, whether they are large corporates or clusters of small corporates, or whether they're hubs in the sense of co-working spaces or places where people come together, we're not trying to build those things. What we want you to do is show us how you can leverage them. So we bringing that together in a partnership, an R&D partnership that addresses the challenges faced by industry. So we'll come back to that in a minute. And the impetus is clearly to step up growth. The Policy and Evidence Centre has its own distinct objectives. So the key features, here we go again, embedded within an existing creative cluster, not a greenfield site, please. But the key is how within that cluster can you identify the barriers that the organisations and businesses have, frame them into challenges, and then coordinate an R&D response to those challenges. So these are just the basics. The application and the partnership has to be hosted by a higher education institution. This is money funded through the research councils, them's the rules. But the partnership has to bring together all the other partners. So it's really, really important, and I'll probably say this again, that the application is made on behalf of the partnership, not on behalf of the host institution. So you need within that partnership and within that bid to show how you can bring together the relevant partners to address the challenges that have been identified. So it's challenges first, then build the partnership. So the partnership will be industry, again, cultural industry and creative industry, local and regional government, the sector bodies, the economic development bodies, the investment communities, how you know all of those people and can bring them together to bear on these challenges that you've worked with the creative industry sector to identify. And then it's a process of a collaborative design and delivery model for an R&D program. And the emphasis here on the R&D is on new activity. And I'll conclude with what I mean by that. It's multidisciplinary. So the key here is, we are the Arts and Humanities Research Council. This is Industrial Strategy Challenge for money. If the challenge that's identified by creative businesses requires multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, or some people say anti-disciplinary approaches, you need to bring the people from those disciplines to bear. What disciplines they are is up to you. So this isn't just about the arts and humanities, or just about STEM, or just about human-computer interaction research. It's about the things that are needed to solve the problem. We do think it will be dynamic, so we want this to be clear, a clear approach and a clear set of challenges at the outset, but we understand that they will change, possibly because of circumstance change, possibly because of opportunity, or possibly just because you want to reinforce what's working and drop some ideas that seem good at the start but don't work. So when we say identifying challenges, what we mean is these are not challenges thought up by the research community. They're challenges that are addressable by the research community and by research methods, but they mustn't be, and I would never want to characterize it like this, things that interest the research community alone. So they have to be defined by needs of the cluster of which the partnership is a part, the businesses and organisations within it. So if you took that challenge and went out, it has to be recognisable by industry as something that's a problem for them, or something that solution of which would aid their growth or allow them to develop new things or new markets or new business models. We want a due focus, and I think we've got all of those rose petals of different aims, but we want due focus on R&D for new product, services and experiences. And I say experiences because that embraces a lot of the things that take us out of the world of content, as people call it, and into a wider experience economy, which seems a particularly exciting place to be. Once you've done all that and identified the challenges, then your partnership's got to have within it the capabilities to address it with the organisations. So in a sense, everybody's membership of the club has to be justified by what they can contribute to the partnership, not potentially who they are. So I know there have been discussions in a nameless region of the UK where it seems that the strategy for this is rather like that of the kind of PhD partnership. So we are a region, There are 8 of these things. We must ensure there is one in this region, so we'll get all of the HEIs to collaborate in one massive bid. That seems to us probably completely the wrong answer. Because the possibility of actually delivering impact, and the possibility, as a cynic might put it, of so much money sticking to the sides, seems considerable. So focus, so it's clear what everybody's contributing to the partnership, and so that you can use the funds to address the problem and bring resources to bear. And we want this to be distinct and measurable. People may have questions about that. I would if I were you. So distinct and measurable, but what we mean as the framework for that is how will it lead to growth in the creative industry? Start thinking from there, and we won't go far wrong. So what do you need? You'll need strategy and vision. These are the things that you'll need in a bid. So all the characteristics and strengths of your cluster, the details of the partnership, who's involved, what are they contributing, the challenges that you're going to address, and how the cluster will benefit from the partnership. It's collaborative R&D, so you want a clear rationale for the program that you're going to take forward and how that relates to the strategy. Sorry, I'll just go back there. And it is about collaboration. The whole thing is about collaboration. But perhaps the incentives of collaboration are not those that are often, in the last few years, have been offered to universities, where there seems to me to have been a lot of incentivization for long-distance, large-scale, widespread collaboration. And perhaps it might be worth thinking that some of the incentives here are to do exactly the opposite, to focus down on a geography, on a sector, with a fewer number of partners, and perhaps predominantly with industry partners as well. You're going to need strong leadership and shared leadership. So who leads, both organisationally, but in terms of personnel, in terms of perhaps not a PI, but a director for this, and as has been mentioned earlier, perhaps that person who's the director of this doesn't necessarily need to be a traditional academic, although a research-based academic may be exactly the right person within your partnership, but we're open to that. And again, I'll say, the application is on behalf of the partnership, not on behalf of the lead HEI. Key dates. So we're doing these engagement events. So we've done London, we've done Bristol, we're going to Newcastle next week for the North East, then Manchester, Scotland, Northern Ireland, London again for London and the South East. Deadline for Statement of Intent submissions, 27th of October. The Statement of Intent is not onerous, we believe. It's been slimmed down. The real purpose of the Statement of Intent is twofold. One is for the Council to have a rough estimate of how many of these things there are going to be, so that we can start to put in place the resource for an assessment process, which is going to come quite soon. The other is so that, again, with a set number of runners and riders and some objectives, we can have a more structured dialogue between now and Christmas, supporting people's bids without having to broadcast to a massive field. I think you probably have all picked up you have to put in a statement of intent to put in a bid. Deadline for applications before Christmas. Outcomes of Stage 1 assessment panel early February. We promise to not let that slip any further, because what the intention is to go to a shortlist and then work with the shortlist. What we want is the best possible bids to come forward. And deadlines for application Stage 2 around about Easter. Everybody will know the outcome of this by June. This is quite an accelerated timescale. One of the guiding factors in that is the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund has a limited life. The longer we delay, the shorter the time we have to spend the money. We've already had to make commitments about how fast we're going to start spending, and the shorter time we have to spend the money, the less wise normally those investments will be. So we want to get this through this stage very quickly. And everybody starts by this time next year. I'll just offer one final thought. When I joined the AHRC as Creative Economy Champion, we talked about what is research in the creative economy or research in the creative industries. And you know, one of the obvious things is there's research about the creative economy. So we all know that's very familiar, it's very valuable. Some would say, even experts in it would say, it's a field that could do with a lot more work in terms of the dynamics of the creative economy. And then I would distinguish this from research about the outputs of the creative economy, academic research. Research with the creative economy. So the AHRC's investment previously in the knowledge exchange hubs really focused on this area, research with the creative economy, different ways of research academics and creative businesses working together through a co-design process. Did some great things. Also showed the limitations of that kind of knowledge exchange approach, very successful engagement with lots of small SMEs, lots of small and micro businesses, but correspondingly small and micro research findings and lack of scalability. So I think that the KE Hub's developed a whole body of how to work. What we're trying to do here is something different, which is to add scale to that. But obviously, it moved the whole discipline on. And the question I had coming in is, what is research for the creative economy? What is the equivalent, in the way that the industrial strategy asks us, what is the equivalent of basic and applied research that generates future innovation and future value within the creative industries? So if I had to characterise this, fortunately, there's lots of voices in this discussion, but if I had to characterise this, it probably isn't very much concerned with research about the creative economy, bar the PEC, which is only designed to do that. It is a bit about research with the creative economy, because obviously this is about industry research, but the focus is not on achieving referable research outputs. So there's always a worry with that co-design work that actually the outputs that it delivers for researchers are very, very successfully achieved, and for businesses, not so much. What it's really about is research for the creative economy. And so it is, and kind of what we're trying to encourage is a new kind of research. So that might encourage you to think, and perhaps you're already thinking, about new ways of doing that, new kinds of research organisations, whether it's labs or studios or drawing people in or fellowships that cross between university and industry, but research for the creative economy. So that's where I will leave that. And if Dylan would like to come and join me on stage, we'll take the questions that hopefully that's provoked. We have roving microphones. And as soon as, excellent, starting us off, there.
I have a question about the
Do you want to say where you're from?
Sorry, I'm Katarina Borsi, University of Nottingham. So you mentioned in the Nesta Geography of Innovation document, and
Yep.
of course we're all being asked to respond or to address an existing cluster. So of course if you look at the Nesta document, Nottingham isn't exactly in there, nor is Birmingham.
It's very true.
Yeah, so but I think my question and what I'm not quite clear about, those of us who were interested in this call, we have to make the case for the existing cluster. And I suspect it'd be useful to use the Nesta definitions loosely. I mean, I know it's not prescribed, but I think, can you clarify that relationship a little bit? And what could we do here in this room, given we're not in this document, to change that?
Okay, so in a way, the absence of some of our cities that do clearly have a significant creative industries within them from the Geography of Creativity report was one reason why we asked Nesta to recut the data, to see if there was something that could be revealed around particular subsectors. So was there a kind of, I know the arguments particularly in Birmingham that have been put as to why Birmingham doesn't appear in the Nesta data. It's a big city, it's got a mixed economy, blah, blah, blah. But so what we thought is, well, maybe it doesn't appear because it's a mass effect of just aggregation of all the different sectors. So that's why we produced that. It's not perfect. The Nesta stuff is not perfect. I don't even think Hassan would think it's entirely perfect. It's got a very strong kind of methodological approach, but that may not reveal what is on the ground. It's just there as a reference point. So if you're in Nottingham or Leicester or Derby or Birmingham, you know what the strengths of the creative businesses are in your sector. If that doesn't appear in the Nesta stuff, don't worry about it. Just tell us why. Tell us what the interactions are. Tell us what the Broadway contributes to Nottingham, how that's articulated, how the game sector works. Tell us. It's not definitive. If there isn't a travel to work area that appears in the Nesta as one of that list of 43, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a creative cluster, but it does mean you have to kind of make reference to why it doesn't appear. And one of the main reasons was to cut. The other reason is to inquire how the inclusion of the software sector within the creative industries data impacted on the data. So that can't be the only question. It really can't. It's a good question, but it doesn't answer everything. Yes, please.
Hi, Matthew Hilton, CAMEo, University of London. I appreciate your interest in new type of research, new types of output. Has there been any conversation with HEFCE as to how that type of output might be reflected in a future ref?
Dylan, that's definitely an AHRC question.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether there has. Julie, have you got any insight on that at all?
So we're conscious of the fact that it's not geared primarily towards published research, although there's no reason why published research couldn't come from the programme. We are, being very open and upfront about the fact that this is very much an R&D programme. We'd like to see that academics' contribution to the programme of finding ways in which to publish research from the programme, and I'm sure academics in the room can think of ways in which that could be done. So it is in there, but it's not explicit for the reasons that we're trying to really direct the focus on the R&D. So no is the answer in terms of questions with HEFCE.
Gary, down the front, please.
Thanks very much. A very helpful exposition, actually, not just of a programme and funding stream, but actually something that I think goes to the heart of this challenge between the sector and the universities and how we really ramp up the opportunity through this piece of work. And I love this notion that we're finally talking about the sector needing R&D funds. So just as we start to think in this region about how we will address the opportunity here, be interesting to get a couple more comments on how you see this affecting the industry side of it. So I chief exec an organisation called Culture Central, which brings together the cultural industries in this part of the world. And if we're going to really get the benefit, not just through the academic institutions, the universities, but through the industry sector itself, you've talked there about existing partnerships, you've talked there about collaborative mechanisms. These things need resourcing and time and effort in order to get the value out of them. And so it'd be interesting just to explore a little bit how you might see this happening from the industry side as opposed to the university side.
Yeah. Well, obviously the call itself includes the capacity to be able to directly fund industry, which is not typical, I guess, with the Research Council.
No, I think it's worth saying. It's very highly unusual.
Yeah, and then there is obviously the expectation that the partnerships are equitable as well. So it's not just a academic institution working, with the odd partner here and there. It's all a very integrated approach to that. So it's a different course. There are mechanisms that are built in to enable that to happen. And obviously, we were talking about it being a dynamic process as well. So with those kind of partnerships and the way the working actually works in practice, will hopefully be able to be developed across the life of the bid. I don't know if Andrew's got anything else there.
Well, I think my guess is we'll get to have a successful outcome here across 8 partnerships. There'll be some common features, but there'll also be people who will approach this in entirely different ways. And that does depend, I think. My guess is there's more variability on the industry side in the partnerships than there is on the HEI side. So, universities are, marvellous and idiosyncratic and distinctive beasts, but they're all universities. Businesses aren't. Businesses are large, businesses are small. Businesses work on a product basis or an agency business model, or a performing arts company. They work on a mixed subsidy and commercial sector model. So there's so much more diversity on the industry side that I think we'll get some very different ways of working coming at the centre of the partnerships, depending on what their focus is, depending on what the challenges are that they approach. So you could see, I don't want to be prescriptive, but some of the things in my mind, so you could see large, say, cultural institutions acting as a kind of hub for a set of businesses and an R&D program that the large cultural organisation or large corporate if that's the case. Large creative industry corporates, there are such things, advertising agencies being particularly prevalent. You could see those acting as hubs in a research programme and a strand, with them mixing with SMEs. So I think Kate from Creative England is going to be on the panel later on. So Creative England have had a lot of success pairing up large corporates with SMEs, and SMEs providing innovation and the corporates providing channels. That's a really interesting interaction with the supply chain, and I think something that, so an agency like Creative England with that expertise could become a crucial partner for some of these partnerships. In other places, I can imagine that you kind of, that you create a kind of lab environment where some of the people in it are effectively from industry, both large and small, and some of them are from universities and from multiple disciplines, and you set a series of challenges, and but it's actually all worked out through conversation in a mutual space. I don't know, but I think there's going to be a lot of diversity. That probably doesn't answer your question, but I think it's really one of a number of things that are for the partnerships to decide, dependent on their partners.
I guess those kind of ways of working are part of what the programme's all about, really. That R&D infrastructure for creative industries that we assume doesn't necessarily operate in the same way as other sectors. So yeah, we hope that that's the sort of thing that will come out of the programme throughout the life of it.
Yeah, and I think those kind of things also will bring in other parts of the partnership and be of interest. So the kind of, whether they're public investors or early stage private investors or large, there are large scale private investors in the Midlands or investment funds interested in this area. I think the different articulations of that give them different things to look at and different things to get engaged with as well. Yeah, over there, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Price and I'm a researcher at Sheffield Uni, but I'm currently working on a big project which involves collaboration with lots of different cultural partners. And I'm just slightly... So it kind of said about developing new products and new services, and you put experiences in there, but I feel like I'm struggling to see how this works in experience-based industries, and ones that are kind of in the performing arts and stuff, which are not-for-profit, which are public sector funded, which are offering free experiences. How there seems to be such a commercial drive behind this, does that not exclude some of, quite a lot of organisations from taking part?
I hope not. Perhaps the objectives are economic growth, so employment, value add. I think the UK cultural and creative industry sector has such a subtle interplay between public funding, not-for-profit and commercial, that achieving those overall aims whilst excluding the talent development that goes on, the creative prototyping that goes on in those kind of organisations. I don't think we've designed it to exclude that, and I think we'd be kind of bonkers if we had, because so much of the value, particularly in the performing sector, that even is subsequently realised as commercial value, relies on that interaction and those other groups. So, in a sense, the focus is economic rather than strictly commercial, I suppose, is how I would think about that. So if you've got a sector and those kind of organisations play a key role in driving that sector forward in terms of creative innovation, then the outcomes that we're looking for are in the sector. So if within a partnership you have a stream that will grow the cluster, but needs to do the R&D with those organisations, then I think that's entirely within scope. But it would have to. But if it's not primarily designed to do that, is this funding for creating free experiences without that ultimate aim, then it's not. If you see what I mean.
Hi, thanks Andrew for the introduction. I just wanted to follow up on this point that you've made about public sector organisations and cultural organisations. I sit on the board of The Space, which is an Arts Council and BBC proposition that supports the transmission of digital skills and technologies to arts organisations, and we're seeing the take-up being incredibly strong because public sector cultural organisations may not have the space to develop the technologies and new approaches to delivering their content in their budgets because of, as you say, they're publicly funded and not-for-profit. This sort of R&D programme might be the way to increase the opportunity for those sort of organisations to do R&D in digital creativity. You'd be encouraging that, Andrew?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we can see some areas, I mean, I think that my colleagues are bored of me going on and on about immersive technologies and the ability to create new experiences using those technologies. But in that kind of area, where the fundamental language is not sorted out, and that whether that fundamental language is how to tell a story in what you might consider a work of art, or whether it's not how to tell a story in what might become the equivalent of a commercial film, it's still at such an early stage that there are fundamental problems that R&D can address and then express it through all of those different channels. We don't, I suppose what I'm saying is we don't even know who the people are who are going to solve that problem. You must have more questions than that, because that wasn't such an exhaustive explanation. Yes, please, at the back.
Oh, hi, I'm Laura White from Nottingham Trent University. Can you talk a bit more about the how you see investors engaging in the programme?
Yeah, so I think we know that one of the problems that the creative sector has is access to finance to scale. To scale and grow, and there's two kind of levels of that. There's well, probably three. There's access to finance itself. So the view of conventional financial mechanisms of the creative industries probably thinks they're much more risky than they are. I think that's something that actually Kate can very, very much talk about through the success Creative England has had in using a mixture of loans and equity investments to source largely from Regional Growth Fund. Those put into the creative sector, creative and digital companies primarily, including ones in the Midlands, have been far more successful than most of the other similar RGF mechanisms. So I think that's one thing is using the experience of public investors like Creative England to enhance access to finance. But there's also, I think, whether it's angels or whether it's venture funds, they are interested in the creative industries, and they are the investment community is always looking for opportunity, and I think opportunity based on R&D and R&D insights is something that they're familiar with other sectors, from the technology sector, from bio, pharma, those kind of sectors. So the idea that investments in R&D embedded within companies that they may allow them to grow or develop IP or unique propositions that perhaps aren't so IP in, will make them more appealing. So I think what we're looking for is the ability to start convening those conversations with these kind of R&D activities. So giving some foresight to those that investment community, but whether it's a mix of public investment, whether it's kind of Midland Engine, large-scale public investment, or whether it's private funds. Giving them insights into future development, I think, is an important part of the conversation. Any more for any more? Yes.
Hi, my name's Ollie Clark from Arch Creatives in Leamington. We're a co-working space that works with many game studios.
Yep.
And thinking of from the SME perspective, it seems there are a lot of universities here which will be working out the bids, but there's a heavy weight on SMEs as well to collaborate with. Could you tell me a little more how SMEs are likely to work in this kind of bid?
Yeah, so I think that you're right in your observation, and that's true across the briefing events that we've done so far. That at this stage, a program of this scale, and with the intention that it's an HEI prime applicant for it, hasn't brought forth the SME community to meetings like this yet. So that presents us with a couple of problems. Is that a comms problem? Maybe. I think the main problem it presents with is the universities who want to bid for this money. So the universities need to engage the sector, and they need to engage SMEs. So one of the notes that we did put out, probably you all got slightly bored of it, was please bring industry partners to these events, if you have any, and be under no illusion that you will have to have some by the time that we get through the bidding process. So I think my message to the universities would be to successfully develop a bid for this, you will need to think over the next few months of how you're going to convene the industry partners, both large and small, and how you're going to create a set of challenges that are their challenges, not your challenges. So that's a key part of the part, and it's a real challenge. That is a challenge. That's why this is different. So I think that I would encourage the HEI partners. I'm sure that they have, there are lots of industry relationships, but thinking of a mechanism by which you consult to create this partnership becomes very essential in this first phase, I would say, because the extent to which the bids are clearly informed by a knowledge of and a collaboration with industry partners is going to be the key success criteria.
Can I follow up? Just another question that comes to mind. You mentioned immersive applications earlier. That's something that I and a lot of other studios in our area are looking at, like augmented reality in particular, mixed reality. But a lot of the funding that's around or has been around up to date has not been helpful for R&D purposes. It's been counterproductive, in fact. Do you see this kind of funding being different and more conducive to R&D in this new medium?
That's an interesting question. I'd like to follow up after why current R&D funding hasn't been helpful. But I suppose if there was a cluster whose HEI and industry partners decided that their focus was on immersive, and there were a real cluster in a location that had, for instance, lots of games companies, that would seem to be a credible bid. It's definitely, it's in the ballpark. There's a series of challenges for the whole creative sector of moving to adoption of those technologies. There's a clear problem with developing the experiences because it's pre-commercial essentially at the moment, apart from the games industry. That's an R&D addressable problem. It's an experience and product problem. It's got lots of input from different research disciplines that are needed to solve it, I think. So it's in the ballpark for this. It's probably worth mentioning that in the conversations around the industrial strategy, that particular challenge has been identified as a distinct problem as well. So whilst it's definitely something that we know is of interest to a broad range of creative sectors, actually, not just the games industry or the screen industries, there's a possibility that may also result in a subsequent challenge or funding program, not similar to this, but from the same source. So it's definitely a key, it's a key area. Do we want 8 R&D partnerships that all look at immersive? Probably not. Okay, we'll take this last one, and then if the panel can kind of ready themselves, we'll move to the panel to pick up on some of these points.
Hi, I'm Henry Chapman from the University of Birmingham. Just picking up on that last point, with something like this, there are so many different types of creative industry, and they are, to some extent, there's permeability between different types of industry as well. And I think one of the big challenges is actually where to draw the line for any one of these partnerships, because they could do so much. Is it the case that the focus should be on those areas which can create a demonstrable change? I think is my question.
I think you're right. I think you're right that drawing the boundary around this. So there's a kind of, this is our cluster. These are the challenges. Which ones are we going to focus on? Is the key kind of decision tree in that, and which ones we're going to focus on? The ones where we could affect most change would be, it's not the only criteria, but it's a very good one, isn't it? I think. You know, I think if the objective, certainly, and the pressure that will come down from it being industrial strategy is what happened? What did it change? How much did it change? Then that, I think, is, amongst all the choices one has to make, that becomes a key one. I think the other one is what are the assets we have? You know, which the cluster and the assets may also play into that, I think. But I think you're right. So that's the $64,000 question.
Yeah. Because there is a bit of a tension, because I guess we're asking for kind of risky approaches and stuff that's going to do stuff in a really new way as well. So there's a bit of a balance there between having stuff that's risky but convincing that you can actually do it, rather than having stuff that is guaranteed success from the outset.
Yeah,
safe,
and that becomes a challenge for us in assessing the bids. So if we say high impact, high risk is what we want, then we've got to make sure that we have a peer review or panel process that doesn't then go, oh, that's a bit risky.
Yeah.
We don't want that. You know, so we know we've got a challenge there in matching the assessment to what you put out. But I think the potential for high impact has got to be you know, and if you can mitigate some of the risky bits of it as well, that would be good. Okay, right, so obviously we can bring out some of the more technical things in the bid writing workshop, which Dylan's leading this afternoon. I'm now going to hand over back to Anthony and our panel to attack some of these. One of the things that I just made me think about that last question is, undoubtedly, I'll say this for you before you do in,
all right.
is one of the attitudes that we've just to risk is not mitigate it, just take it.
You've just nicked my line.
I know.
It's true. Okay, you're right. We're missing Doris. Hello. Oh, hello again. So we'll just get Doris mic'd up. Are you okay, John?
Yes.
Just briefly introduce everybody down the panel. So on my far left, John White, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the space, which is based here.
Yes.
And in the interest of full disclosure, John worked with me when I worked at the space a couple of years ago. So just so you know that. David Furmage, who looks after creative, digital and cultural at Birmingham, Greater Birmingham. And Solihull LEP, and we just worked out we've known each other on and off quite a long time as well. I don't know how that happens. Kate Adam, who I haven't just met, who looks after business investment, project manager in that side of things for Creative England, and Doris Eikhof, who I've just met, who is Deputy Director of CAMEo at the University of Leicester, as it says on your document. These guys were sent this kind of daunting set of possible questions I might ask. Not going to start with those. From what you've heard today, starting with Doris at this end, so from what you've heard today so far, where do you think both the interesting innovations in the programme and the challenges in delivering it are?
Okay, I think the interesting overall innovation in this programme for me is that it's got the chance to really dispense with some of the challenges we've had in getting HEIs and creative businesses, organisations, however, together in the past.
Okay, dig into that.
I think what's really held us sort of back is that the policy language that we've got in the UK to articulate and tackle challenges in this area actually doesn't really fit the creative industries, the arts and culture. There are lots of concepts in there, lots of assumptions. We've discussed this idea earlier of what's a business, what's business a shortcut for in the creative and cultural industries. And that then feeds through to the creative industries not being visible. Or large parts of it not being visible. For instance, in the Nestor report, in employment statistics that only look at normally employed people, that don't take freelancers into account, for instance,
right.
Anything that's predicated on this idea of somebody's got does research and development, develops a widget or a new product or service or experience that then goes into a production, gets produced, gets marketed. At the end of the day, people get a salary, go home, stakeholders and shareholders get a little bit, and that's it. That's not the process, the linear business process that we've got in the creative industries.
Yep.
And lots of the previous mechanisms for supporting the creative industries were predicated on that particular model. So the KTPs, for instance, lots of the regional, I should probably declare my background here. So I've been one of the co-leads of the Digital R&D Fund Research Consortia. I've done a KTP with an arts organization, which was extremely challenging. I've done various small ERDF-funded business development programs with arts organizations. And underlying all of this was this model that just only captures this much of arts and culture and creative industries. And I think that's one of the shackles that we can kind of really throw off with this program and look a little bit more, okay, what are the challenges? How do we articulate them in a way that, yes, plays to overall policy ambitions, but in ways that actually addresses the challenges rather than grapples with concepts like industry or business.
Really interesting. I mean, that sort of echoes something that David Eastwood and I were talking about, doesn't it, to some extent, about, I think I was asked at AHRC Council by somebody who wasn't from the creative industries, how are we going to deal with the problem of cultural value and commercial creative value? And I said by just ignoring it, on the grounds that it doesn't really help in what we're trying to deliver here. But how does that work in a LEP, David? I'm going to come to you, because the data is important, the way the data is gathered is important. Yes. In the end, the way the thing is measured and success is measured is important. And we have this odd situation in the measurement of Birmingham, Greater Birmingham, etc.
We could just sign off that, couldn't we? The Nesta quotient statistic, as it measures sort of clusters specifically, it obviously scores Birmingham lower because there are so many other industries. We're just having some mapping done for us right now by BOP Consulting. So we know we have, for example, 50,000 creatives, and that's larger than advanced manufacturing.
Okay.
So, for us, that's...
So it's something. So within that, the methodology of sort of how the ranking was done.
That works broadly, but not completely. Yeah.
No, which I think would be acknowledged, wouldn't it? I think in general. Okay.
Nesta put a footnote in there somewhere.
I would imagine they do. Yes. They're very good at those.
So we are, as a LEP, we are business and industry-facing part of the devolution agenda. We are obviously economic growth jobs, but also quality of life.
Sure.
So cultural industry is crucial to us, working with Gary Top as well. On the actual question, we feel that we need to sort of winkle out the actual best at creative ideas wherever they are. So we would look at a sort of region-wide, West Midlands-wide view to say, well, how do we sort of get those hidden ideas sort of emerging? So we see this sort of cluster's journey helping the ideas come forward,
right,
to find some IP on them, because often businesses, they know they have something, but they don't know how to move it forward, and they have absolutely sort of zero resources to actually do that. Or they don't know they have a really strong idea anyway. So that there's a real sort of early journey for opening up to new areas. And on the issue of which sectors, we have some high growth sort of sectors here, sort of, there's advertising, marketing, ICT games, serious games, and sort of film, TV, sort of AR, VR, things like that. But I think there's scope to open up to all the areas really, because if it's too narrow on individual sectors, we will miss so much. So Excellent. We'd like to see a slightly broader approach on the actual process of actually bringing up some new ideas, so they can be funded, into pipelines like yours.
And so, what were the LEP and the LEPs kind of interconnection with the programme be? Do you think? I know because we talked about it earlier, and I knew there was a big meeting in London yesterday of a sort of network of LEPs, which AHRC people presented at. So, is there an obvious way of docking the programmes together or the activities together?
We met with DCMS yesterday, 26 LEPs. They were talking about how the Bazalgette sector deal would work, and how we'd marry together different funding sources. So partly there's some sort of repurposed money for that sector deal. There's a cultural challenge fund, which was potentially
under discussion.
£500 million, probably not. And so they were trying to sort of marry that cultural bit to the whole sort of creative, as well, which there's an overlap, but it, but it isn't perfect. And so our point of view, we work closely with sector intermediaries. So we feel that universities have to grow and help the actual sector organisations. So that's games clusters, because industry trusts the actual sector leaders. Mm-hmm. In a sense, they know best. So we work with them. We're hoping to fund some of them, as well. So that's would be our approach.
So and you're going to be very active in that here by the sound.
We are active. We're launching a creative economy strategy quite shortly. It aligned with Bazalgette almost completely, so it's signed off basically everything in there. We obviously don't have that much money, but we know what has to be done, and we're working on it with all available sources. So we're extending growth hubs, business support, funding. We want to influence the Midlands engine, 250 million, so it also covers creative IP, as it sort of covers it slightly but not much.
Right.
So we want to influence. We're also working with IPO on a pilot scheme to help again to understand the actual value for a creative industry. So we think we are a glue at an industry business level to give a voice to the actual sector experts there and help them to get into this fairly complex area which we're dealing with.
Yeah, it is a complex area. And I'm going to sort of address that question. I'm going to ask Kate to talk about it, and John in a moment, of kind of getting industry and sector actual participants more involved. We haven't started a kind of consumer comms campaign yet, or even a trade comms campaign. And so I think I opened the London event with the statement, welcome all my HEI colleagues. I wonder what it is about the £85 million programme that's brought you all here today. But actually in industry, it may not be all that interesting unless it's actually your topic, or unless it is your area of R&D passion. Or it may be very interesting, but to the wrong people. The sort of people who aren't those sort of companies. So Creative England is one of those sector intermediary type entities. How does what you've done so far, what can we learn from what you've done? How can we dock on to what you're doing with this?
I actually think it would be very interesting for businesses, this fund, because so Creative England, we work with creative digital SMEs all around England, helping them access finance and supporting their business. And that whole idea of accessing finance for R&D is really tough.
It's really hard money, isn't it?
Investors don't want to come in at the R&D phase. They want you to have been through that phase, to have shown that your product, your bit of IP is great, and then that's when they want to come in.
Right.
So a fund where they, this is purely what this fund is. I think businesses would relish being part of this, to be honest.
Do you think both, it's not sides, but you think both sort of major kinds of entity understand the same thing by R&D? Okay, go on, Doris, and I'll come to John in a minute on that, because something he and I dealt with a lot when we were at the space together. But it seems to mean lots of different things to lots of different, and that's fine. Yes. But how do we? Let me be more positive. How do we frame it in such a way that everybody can join in around it, rather than it being, well, that's not R&D. It's not the Frascati definition of technical R&D, or that's not research and development. That's what I do in theatre, in the rehearsal room when we're improvising a play, and that's about as far away as you can get. But I've heard them both described as R&D. So is that true? And if so, what do we do about it?
Yes, that's absolutely true, but I'm not really sure that definition matters in the same way that, as we've discussed before, I think the challenge of this program is that it's not really clear that it matters what exactly the creative industries are. We're looking at the activities and the challenges. And I think in that way, it's more about articulating what is it actually that you want to do, what's the novel thing that you bring to the table, and the challenge is not so much, I think, having that recognized in a Frascati definition or whatever. I think the challenge really is to bring practitioners and academics around the table and to develop their shared language for that particular activity, not across the piece, but for that activity, to be able to advocate for it. Really, and that's the analogy I would have is if you get two families together for Christmas, try to develop a shared language around what's a formal Christmas, what's an informal Christmas, when does it even get celebrated. So it's kind of the same process, bringing two parties together and saying, for this problem, what's our language for articulating what would be really good, what would be a really novel way of attacking that, why does the world need this? What is it about here?
Right.
And to making that case, but not towards then, not with the aim to hit the Frascati definition, but with the aim to produce something that's really good and valuable and that we want.
So that's a good segue over to you, John, in terms of sort of the role of an organisation like the Space, but also probably more than that, the learnings that you have and that you've had through the Space. So you've got a board member in the room as well, remember, Johnny's here. I'm your former chief executive, so think nicely about it. No pressure. Part of the role of the Space, as this kind of joint venture effectively between the BBC and the Arts Council, has been to help build skills and capacity in the funded arts sector. And a chunk of that's been about taking risks on things you haven't done before and R&D on projects or finding new ways of doing projects. So from that experience, what advice do you give to me? I never said that when we were working together. What advice do you give to me and to the programme about what we can learn from how you put teams together, how you set expectations, how you measure success, anything that you've learned over the 3 or 4 years you've been doing that?
I mean, I think it's about having that scope and flexibility for, this is both the kind of really exciting opportunity about this sort of programme and also the challenge is how you set about on its focus. So for a lot of the organisations we're working with, they're incredibly resource-constrained arts and cultural organisations. So much as they want to pick into some of the R&D opportunities there, they have to do it in a very limited way. So it's looking at a programme of work that's got a particular focus on a problem that whatever solutions you find are then replicable, can be adopted by others, but that you can iterate on that quite rapidly within those limited resources.
Right.
And that the research element of that, what sounds exciting here is this research that it could be quite a dynamic process, quite a well-supported process, that there isn't this expectation that you'll be able to fund and resource a whole load of activities on your own initiative and go off. But yeah, the core principles of being able to experiment in a light touch way, but with an eye on what the wider opportunity is, and then learn from that and cycle through. I think that's the main thing.
And so this is not leading you, but it is. So before the Space, you ran a digital agency, successful digital agency, Muso. Is anything you just said not applicable to what you/I used to do inside a digital agency when you're trying to develop a new proposition or you're trying to find an answer to a client brief? I mean, is it not comparable to what you do?
It's absolutely the same. It's the same issues broadly, and it's the same set of challenges. And in some cases, it's the same collaborations that we're trying to look at now between the arts and cultural sector and game developers and other interactive participants, which is how do you make, if you like, the business case? What do you think the business case is? How do you get the investment? So for an arts organisation where you've got a publicly funded model where the content is broadly, freely available, how do you start to evidence what the wider impact of that is? How it might start to build into a sort of commercialisable content strategy. So you've got the same kind of imperatives driving it, and then you've got the same issues in terms of the partnerships that you need to build out to realise that strategy. So, it has to be collaborative, but how do you balance the risks? How do you look at the intellectual property aspects? So you've got a model that, if it is successful and starts to take off, you can then replicate it and all the partners are benefiting and the wider sort of cluster is benefiting from that activity.
Okay, so and to all the panel really then, I don't know who was here and who wasn't for Sir David Eastwood this morning. One of the things that struck me about David, he's a very sort of practical, pragmatic and charming man in lots of ways. And one of the things he said was, look, get clear at the top of a partnership what you're all trying to do and make sure you're all trying to do the same thing. Don't rock up just for the money, which I thought was a pretty unusual thing for a VC to say. Don't rock up just for the money. And I kind of inferred from what he was saying, one of my own principles, which is be clear on what you're willing not to do, what you're going to give up in order to do the thing you're trying to do. Don't try and put everything in there. I mean, did what he say ring true to you, David?
We'd like to see a creative innovation audit. We think it is too easy to do something like this and you just kind of do the sort of same old sort of usual highlighted things. We feel that there's a chance to really look at the whole sector. The science and innovation audit was hugely helpful to us, and we think we need something like that.
So unpack for me what that would involve.
That would mean, the example I can give you is the Transport Catapult. When they came here, they presented 8 key transport challenges, and they did them in a really brief, simple way. And I asked them afterwards, well, how will people understand what you're actually talking about? They said, well, we've researched every single transport business in the entire country. We know all the expertises and the market, so we're only finding out where the actual gaps are. So I think, again, I've been working with the mayor, and we know that the actual sector is highly fragmented. So there's real sort of geographic fragmentation. This is a chance to join the whole region together. I don't mean that the work is spread in more than sort of maybe 2 centres, but we have to, I think, address the whole sort of West Midlands as our playground, and therefore we have to understand what is there to begin with. We have to understand what's there, and then begin to see how we can sort of develop it. And so there's a real role there for sort of data sort of brokerage, managing that process, which feels like that would be really excellent. As a starting point.
So you're arguing for a sort of data or a sort of evidence-based starting point.
Absolutely, but I'm saying let's not have it too constrained. We would rather not just deal with the obvious suspects, although we do feel games is important, sort of, you know, as it happens. But yes, so we want to, because I think, does it have to be just 1 or 2 sectors? Is it about the ideas? So is it about the actual process learning? You know, how do we do the actual process of developing ideas, so as it was, whichever sector they come from, be they a cultural sort of, you know, or not. So
that's the kind of target. It could be if it was done in this region. That's the kind of targeting exercise that helps you narrow down on what your challenge might be for this bid, or for something else, or a general part of your strategy. Longer term, it could be something that the Policy and Evidence Centre that's part of this programme might well take on as a more systematic thing, if that was part of the bid. I don't know if there's anybody thinking of bidding for that. Doris, that's one of your specialist subjects, the sort of how do you measure modes of measurement of this kind of activity. We talked a little bit beforehand, and I'm not going to jump to KPIs, but I sort of am. One of my personal sort of obsessions here is that, and Andrew, I know, said it earlier, is that the programme remains flexible enough, and he did say, let's not use the agile word too much, but flexible enough so that you're measuring measuring meaningful outcomes. Are there changes in what's measurable? Are there changes of how we should be measuring that we should build into the programme, not just jobs made, you know, number of hits on website type of KPIs?
I'll start with the second question.
Yep.
Yes, of course, we should change that. And partly the audit that you mentioned is exactly the case in point, because the creative industries fell out of that audit. Because it focused on things that aren't easy. The way it was structured wasn't conducive to articulating what is there in the Midlands.
Didn't Einstein say
to be said.
You should avoid counting what you can count and make sure you count what counts? And that's a quote that's often attributed to Einstein.
Yes. So I think that, and that's why I'm so keen to pick up on that challenge-led aspect of the programme, because it does offer the opportunity for people to come together and to say, what is it that we have reason to value doing, and how can that be articulated? And when you have that conversation with each other, you automatically have a conversation about how do we articulate that to a third person, in this case a funder or a policy maker. And it's not necessarily in jobs created. Jobs created is such a... my mum told me never to say stuff like that in public. But if we think about jobs created in the arts, culture and creative industries, how many people in that sector that we're thinking about hold more than one job? So what does that jobs created tell me as a policy person? That really is not a very valid instrument that I can use to address the challenges in the industry. So we'll need to think about other stuff. We need to think about measuring how long do people engage with particular cultural activities, and what does that therefore do to their lives? How does that improve their lives? How does that improve cohesion in communities? How does that improve the thinking that we have about ourselves as a society, for instance? And that engagement could be through work, but it could be as a prosumer, if it's a digital activity. It could be in contributing to debates that are held within communities, so we need to find measures of engaging that, whether that be done through technology, through measuring social media engagement. But I think just thinking through these ways of articulating activity in arts, culture and creative industries, that could actually be innovations that could come out of these partnerships. So
that's really interesting. I'm going to viva you like I did David Eastwood briefly though. So because you hopped from the measurement of jobs isn't the right measure to the measure of engagement, and I buy both of those things. But actually, I'm probably one of the people who the National Audit Office are going to hold up if this doesn't work. And so I'd quite like to know what a better measure of economic value and growth might be. Because I will have to be, somebody, probably use me as a proxy, somebody will have to say what that is down the line. And so you don't have to answer it, but when, in fact, I won't make you answer it, but when Creative England looks at something like that, where do you measure the value?
Well,
and you can come
historically,
back.
we've been constrained by measuring because
What they're expecting.
Because it's been public funds. So jobs created and match funding is the, that's the obsession.
Yeah.
And exactly like you said, the issue with jobs created is it doesn't account for the creative industries, freelance work. You just can't count that. So there's whatever it is, half.
But so does that lead us back to Doris? Does that lead us to sort of versions of personal GVA or some sort of,
I think that leads us into a very interesting conversation with sister disciplines that talk about the quality of job quality, even at OECD level and UN level. That's a really interesting topic that's being discussed at the moment. So let's not just talk about how many people are employed in those industries, but let's talk about the qualities of the jobs that they experience. Another way of looking at it is alternative measures of growth, of well-being, of flourishing. There again, if we're looking at more heterodox economics, for instance, or if we're looking at much more sort of household names like Oxfam, there are models out there, their donut model of growth and well-being, for instance. There are models out there that we can engage with where the types of activities that people in the arts, culture and creative industries have value to do are much more recognized, and where we've got other ways of articulating them that I think we can bring into our ways to have conversations then with the funders that we're engaging with and saying, okay, you wanted us to say how many jobs or how many products we've sold, so here's that figure, but here are the other measures, and now let's have a conversation about why these measures will tell you, funder, you politician, much more about what we're doing than these other two numbers that we've just given you.
Right, it's really interesting. Anybody want to come in on?
Could I come
David,
in on that? From the LEP's point of view, we would want to build capacity for the actual cluster. So we also have sort of job target measures, but we also have quality of life measure. And so we're wanting to make, obviously, the actual West Midlands sort of, as it were, higher profile on the world stage. And that's why, Mayor talked about sort of bringing in Channel 4 and the Commonwealth Games bid, etc., etc. So for us, if you're growing activity, then there's more work happening. If more things happening, there are more people working, be they staff, freelance. So jobs do matter really, but as you say, they are slightly fluid. But so we want more things happening here, and for London and other places to see this is the place that we're really strong on say games again.
Right.
So that's our target. So our actions are to basically
to
grow
improve those things.
The industry sectors and sort of bring people
in. Doris?
I'd like to come in on that one. So for instance, when you talk about growing jobs, yes, we can argue about the detail, how we define that, all good. But one of the issues that we see coming up is the issue of a pipeline of talent and skills into the creative industries. Yeah. Now, if we look at academic research, one thing that's incredibly clear is that we've got an issue with ambition, recognition of the creative industries as a provider of employment and careers, and then the ambition to actually enter those industries, to go into education and training that allows young people to provide the skills and talent that they have to the industries. We don't so much have that issue of recognition and perception in certain white middle class areas, but especially across the Midlands, we've got a huge issue with more ethnically diverse, with more socioeconomically diverse populations, recognizing that the creative industries is something where you can work, where you can build a career, where you can make your talents and skills available. So one of the measures could be, you can do big cohort studies of university applications and so on to see, okay, where does that ambition actually come from? Do we nurture it? Do we nurture it in the right places? So that might be an alternative measure.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. The sort of wider conversation about diversity's not come up in quite the way I think we imagined it would at these events so far, but I think it's worth just being really clear that if in a cluster bid, in a geography, there are very particular aspects of that bid which are rooted in what the Arts Council will call a creative case for diversity, which actually recognises all the things you just described as enormously powerful points of difference, then that's likely to score pretty high, not because of some abstract notion of diversity, because it's true. And because it is deliverable against the challenge objective. And so I think there's no way of beating around the bush on that. There's a lot of activity in parts of the creative industries about this topic, but a piece of this, the architectural job of this program, over a 10-year program, if you like, or even a 20-year timescale, is to try and help reconfigure the architecture of the relationship between HE and creative industries more generally. And that's why, David Eastwood, for instance, saying he was very, very adamant at council level at AHRC that if a university wanted to play in this field, they had to bring some money to the table at a proper scale, because otherwise they were not credibly playing. And if they want to do that in health sciences, it's not £500,000. To get the university to respond in that way, and he's a VC of a pretty big university. Now, there's a counter argument to that, which is that might keep other players out. And so, that is why you'll have noticed that there is no minimum or maximum size to a cluster in the call. It's why you'll have noticed it says up to 8. We're able to be responsive to what comes forwards. But they're meant to be serious interventions in that long-term way as well as in the shorter term. And to come to the skills point, I think I said a little bit in my opening remarks. I'm going to ask John sort of to some extent about this. The development of skills through research and development and making of projects is one of the things the space is about, and bringing together those different kinds of people. It's not always very easy, is it?
No, and that's one of the the big barriers. And I was just looking at some research from the organisations. We worked with about 150 organisations the last 4 years, and their barriers. And it is that access to skills, and it's the access to partnerships, and in a way that I guess for those scales of organisation is not intimidating, where the objectives are likely to be aligned with the partnerships that they've got. And just it loops back to the KPI point and what you were saying earlier about the priority of beginning to evidence this in year 1 and in year 2. Some of these wider impacts will take a while to feed through, but one of the early initial impacts that we get already on projects we're on is the partnerships that are formed from the first project, then subsequently lead to other projects that are not part of our programme of activity, but are just immediately sort of coming up organically and being recognised as value, and it's allowing them to upskill people in-house and get that practical insight. And I think one of the really interesting areas is then looking at the bridge between higher education, between the graduates and people on those programmes, and how you can embed them in this kind of real action research so that they're then familiar with the environment that they're hoping to have careers in.
Right.
And hopefully are staying within the cluster, within the local area when they graduate. And that's a really interesting dynamic.
So I'm going to come to Kate for a view on that in a minute, but just sort of gloss it slightly as well with sort of specifics on the programme. And Andrew's talked about the bid, and the bid workshop this afternoon we'll talk about it. So whilst in the bid, an HEI cannot count its PhD investments as being part of the match fund for this bid. Clearly, if there are PhDs which are operating in the area of the cluster, or there could be down the line, that is there's a kind of environmental factor that indicates your seriousness. And one of the things we're discussing at AHRC Council at a higher level is the kind of comparative oversupply of PhDs into academia. There are too many PhDs, not enough jobs. And whether that, to some extent, whether we need to shift the expectation that a PhD in an arts and humanities subject is really quite handy in large parts of the creative industries and some of the skills you might develop. So if you go back to the conversation that was beginning around immersives earlier, if we were Stanford at the moment, we would be feeding PhDs with immersion skills into an industry. The whole country's not doing that. Not at all. And those people, such as they would be coming out of engineering and science disciplines, which of course you need. But not only. And so there is a kind of question about what does a PhD look like in the creative industries down the line? How might this programme help understand that? It's quite an interesting question. I say that because I also chair the doctoral training partnerships for the HRC. And we can't keep everything standing as it is. Things have to develop in those fields. So I'm going to come to a different version of that question for you. So in a way, what John was saying, in the commercial world, when you're collaborating with institutions and bringing partnerships together, that happens in supply chains too. So a lot of when I was running a 60-person digital outfit, we did a lot of that on the BBC's time and money. We would get a project which we didn't know how to do, and we would convince the BBC it was a good idea, or Channel 4 actually. Every innovation award I've won has been won on a public service broadcaster's money in television. Your Big Guy, Little Guy programme at Creative England's an interesting way of doing that,
yes.
I think.
Yes, absolutely. And we know that big corporates, big brands, big slow-moving beasts like the NHS, they're really keen, they're really interested to access small digital companies, new innovations, new ideas. And what we do is we help broker those deals. We help very small digital companies access these big supply chains.
Right.
So, we've worked with Sony, we've worked with Microsoft, we work with Sky, we work with the NHS, basically helping broker those deals and helping these small companies who would no way be able to, shout from in all that noise to access these supply chains. So these big corporations are desperate to access new ideas and new talent, and but it's about making sure those little companies don't get lost, and that their needs and that their outcomes don't just get washed away by these bigger guys, basically. So we can help that.
I'm going to come to the room for questions. So if you've got anything, stick your hand up. Otherwise, I'll ask one more while you're pondering. I'm going to ask one more while. Oh no, down at the front. Here we go. Well done. Thank you. Usual drill, name and affiliation, please.
Gary Top, Chief Executive, Culture Central. I don't know if it's a question, but let's see if we can.
Go on, you don't have
really.
to, just tell us something.
Yeah, I'm interested, as somebody that established and ran a regional observatory, to hear a little bit more actually about the thinking around the data project, whatever that's called. Forgotten what it's called.
Policy and Evidence Centre.
Thank you, that one.
Yep.
I always enjoy it. Never forget the role of bullshit in policy making as well. And
is there a role for anything else?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so to try and pick up on that a little bit, and I think, Doris, you were taking us down some really interesting ideas that could both inform this programme, but also to say that I'm really enjoying the fact that this programme is actually, in establishing itself, I think beginning to create a forum to ask some questions that the industry's been a bit shy of for a long time. So there's a kind of congratulations in there somehow, that this is not just a call for bids, but actually has some really strong thought behind it. And to just pick up on a little bit of that, this notion of GVA or jobs created and the old way of measuring stuff, I sometimes think as a sector we're still more shy around those metrics than many other industries are.
Right.
And the, just you mentioned some of the other social value models, whether that's the donut one and somebody once told me there's 1,200 of those models out there. But somehow or other, we don't really get confident around those in this sector. And I think we could look a lot more at those. And also this way that cities globally are presenting their evidence base to create a narrative about themselves. And the power of that narrative to create inward investment, to do all of those things that this programme's got to do, seems to me actually also to be one of the reasons why this particular city just didn't get the showcasing that it needed in that Nesta report. It just has not got its narrative right. So, and there's a technique to getting your narrative right. There's lots of people out there studying the narrative of cities and how to do it well. So just a couple of suggestions there. Love those social impact tools in terms of evaluation. It'd be great to have that as part of the policy making thing. But also look to the way that city and city thinking is going and see what relationships and learning we might do from that as well as part of this programme.
Okay, really helpful. Anybody want to react in particular? Doris?
I'd quite like to pick up on an irony there, and that's about narratives. If there's anywhere in our society that actually has the capacity, the creativity, the language to come up with narratives, it's the arts, culture and creative industries. So what's gone wrong that we've left the storytelling that we are allegedly so well trained to do to other people? And I think that's, if we start asking those questions, we might be able to better engage with those conversations.
I think I have a keynote on that, which is about the use of the term subsidy when you mean investment, and the general kind of lack of confidence of this sector. I've been around the kind of policy making, I'm a maker of companies primarily and of projects, but I've been around the policy making one way or another for 20 odd years. And it's only very recently that even we've started believing the data. And it's only very recently that even we have started acknowledging that perhaps it was a bit hyperbolic for a while, and possibly it still is, and that kind of narrative is sort of settling. There's a confidence that you need to have. You need to look them in the eye calmly in these policy discussions in number 10 and HMT, because I've had to do it, and go, actually accept. Here's a confident, calm and non-hyperbolic statement about why this is a good thing for you to do. And then be ready with the narrative. And I have to say, in this confines of this room, please don't tweet, I did say, you could just say you're just going to make everybody redundant using robots and AI. That would be fine as well. Or the narrative could also have some things about social cohesion, creativity, good lives worth leading, and a thing we're really great at on the international scale. That might be an alternative narrative. So you can do threat whilst being calm, but you know, previously the narrative has been very much, you know, please subsidise us more, we haven't got enough money. That's not the narrative. We can do more with more money, gets you to the same place, but it's a different ask.
And I just wanted to come in with a positive example where it's been very, very tricky, but showed that change is possible, and that's the movement from a minimum wage to a living wage. That was a lot of very kind of small activities, work behind the scenes that people had to do to convince policymakers that actually striving for a living wage is a much more sane thing to do than just setting a minimum wage that then sort of gets acted on around the country. And I think that might be one of the processes where we can actually learn from others.
David?
From the LEP's point of view, we know we have to make that case better, more clearly. You know, the mayor being on our side, that's helpful. So we're working with Gary and others to start doing that. So it's on our sort of pipeline of actions to make more noise about, you know what we have here. So we realise we haven't, but we also still have to make that case, because obviously the money is still controlled by a Treasury, for example, and they want the economic arguments as well, so we have to sort of blend both arguments. You know, the social arguments.
We sort of stereotype that. We stereotype that in the conversations we've had policy-wise to get this fund through. As there are people who just believe what we're really trying to do underneath all this is build some more theatres in Liverpool. That's what we're really trying to do, which might be something somebody does as a result of this. Who can tell? Because you can make money out of theatres. Look at the man. You know, Andrew Lloyd Webber did okay. Cameron McIntosh did okay. Usually, in Cameron's case, out of public investment in the innovation in the first place. But we weren't trying to say that, and just getting that clear is really significant. The other thing I really learned from this was from Nicola Mendelsohn, who is the chief exec, the head of Europe, Middle East and Asia for Facebook in London, who chairs the Creative Industries Council. And Nicola just said, nobody asks for enough money. You go in asking for a couple of £1 million, that's the Research Council's problem, or the Arts Council's problem, or the Film Council's was, or the BFI's problem. You're going asking for £500 million, and they wake up. Actually, there's something oddly true about that.
Can I just say, having watched it, if you ask for £500 million, you get sort of...
You get 50 million
outside.
to go
you
away.
might get more, yes, but I think, we do have to ask for more, but we do have to find ways of working with less, apparently.
Oh, well, always, of course. But you've got to ask in a context where there is some money. There's £4 billion in the industrial strategy. John?
But just at the SME and the small organisation scale that we're working at, we've already got, really excitingly on different initiatives, sort of the anecdotal evidence that shows you can build and demonstrate a value proposition. And what's exciting for us is for not that much more effort and these sorts of partnerships, if you can get some academic rigour and some research around that and start to test out those models and say, okay, we did that there, can we replicate it over here? It's just the logical next step for us and for the organisations we're working with. So that's what we want to see more of.
Other thoughts, questions, contributions from the floor? Must be.
Can I just mention two things quickly?
Fire away.
I've worked with some EU cluster excellence projects for several years, and there's two examples I'd like to cite where we could learn from. One is in France, where they have a strong cluster programme, and they always got the larger SMEs, these Google types, to sort of put in some membership fees, maybe it's like $50,000 per year, to help do these big guy, little guy stuff. So there's a way of because they wanted to reach the ideas lower down. So France has been doing these things for a long time. And in Germany, we funded a co-working centre, which was funded entirely from private money, but it happened because the Actor Munich government was willing to just underwrite it. They didn't have to pay any money. And so we don't take enough risks with public money, and that is damaging basically what we actually can do. So I think we can learn lots of lessons from cluster excellence, basically right through Europe, and some can be applied here.
Can I ask for some advice from the panel then in terms of... Johnny, sorry, I didn't see you. Johnny Turpey, question. While Mike's going, I'm just going to tee you up this question. Some advice on how we make the decisions on which clusters should win and who is involved. Because just while Johnny's... Have you got a mic, yeah? Well, just to be clear, those of us who are chairing the I'm chair of the programme board, various of us on the board, people like Andrew Thompson, the chief executive of the AHRC, we are insulated from the eventual decision. There will be a peer review process, That peer review process will not be the traditional only academic peer review process. We're expecting industry people, we're expecting trade body people, we're hoping to also get people from international comparators, so those are very helpful ideas for us, David, into that process. But clearly, the decision's got to be right. So coming back to you will be, ensuring that somehow those decisions are well made and how they're framed. But Johnny might be asking something completely different, but hold that in your heads. Johnny.
I just wanted to follow on the diversity point, which I think this region has a particular focus on and expertise in. And it's great to hear about France and Germany. But if you go to the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, Gallery 14, before you leave for London or wherever you're going, you'll see Knights of the Raj, which is an exhibition about the history of curry houses made by Muhammad Ali from Spark Hill in Birmingham, who also included augmented reality in the exhibition. So it's happening here. The job that this august group has got to do is to focus that and then deliver a bid that builds on the R&D opportunity for companies and individuals like Muhammad that are delivering great products.
Yes, what you said. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Exactly what you said. And that's, I know, I heard Andrew Chitty express, and I'll quite sometimes say even more bluntly, but I think he said it as bluntly as it can be said. If there is an industry and activity and practitioner-led sort of middle to a bid, I was asked by some august HE institutions that shall go unnamed in London, well, if we partner with these guys and those guys and these guys and these guys, we'll get it, won't we? Maybe, but it'll sort of depend on what your question is and your challenge and whether you've got industry involvement or not. Please don't carve it up like it's the DTPs, where there are enough of each institution and everybody gets a bit. It's not that kind of money. It's actually got to work in a fundamentally different way. And I think you will have heard that. But that does come to my meta question, which is, but how then do we make sure that the decisions are actually in line with the strategy? So tips for us. David.
Okay, I would say we start with the actual bid has to fully understand the actual creative opportunities, so that whole sort of audit understanding, they have to have that in there. They have to lean on cluster sector intermediaries, so they have to understand that the expertise is really sort of in the actual industry itself, so have those key players involved.
Right.
Want to make sure, crucially, that the actual process journey is there, so developing those ideas, that's where there's a real sort of innovative sort of teaching edge they can sort of bring in. So we have to get the ideas developed so they can become funded by other things and then connect closely to the other funding streams that then come in. So growth hubs, skill hubs, funding like yours. So there's a lot of things where we have to join up those dots. But obviously where the gap is that early thinking. We don't know the potential of the ideas that are there. We don't know how to develop them and how to move them on. So that's the sort of core bit that I think this does. And the LEP feels that we have a strong role and we can bring some match perhaps to some of these things because
Somebody
we
write
work
that down.
closely within. Well, match is a challenge, I think, for all.
We've written it down. You said it's on camera now.
We have some potential capital. We'll see what happens. But certainly, we feel that we are close to industry and so trying to understand what their needs are. But clearly, we don't know enough.
Okay, so I'm going to come to Kate, because you're in that statement from David, a really interesting and helpful one. So intermediary organisations, how do you help and assist in this process, and how can we help you do what you're trying to do at the same time?
Well, it's got to work for the SMEs. So, it's got to, it can't just be academic research that doesn't take them anywhere, has no commercial benefit, and it's got to feed the industrial strategy. So I'd really encourage the academics to really talk to the SMEs. What are their thoughts at the beginning of the process? What are they working on? Don't just find some money to carry on some academic research that's already ongoing.
No.
This is a
different thing.
A different thing, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So John, we have run together lots of processes for making decisions on, in the case of one of our funding rounds, many hundreds of proposals for something. So tips on configuring the process, tips on getting people to understand, as David says, that what we're trying to do, getting the right people. I mean, where are the pain points? Where are the opportunities and the pain points in running a process like that?
In terms of the assessment of it, I mean, it's trying to drill down with the mindset of both how are you going to evidence this very initially, that it's focused on a core objective, that it's taking down a barrier to entry or whatever, and then towards the end of that life cycle or the legacy, is this activity, if we do this, we support this now, what's the next step for those organisations that we've supported? How will they evolve? Can they sustain this with their new partnerships beyond the lifespan of that? So you want that early evidence combined with the
indication of the direction of long-term travel.
Yes, albeit you're not going to know which of these models will gain traction and which less so, but were they to gain traction, are they things that can then be carried forward without the need for yet another large-scale sort of cash injection intervention?
Yeah, okay. I mean, David Eastwood, I think, again, had something interesting on that when I asked him about the kind of leadership, the directorship of the cluster, and he sort of echoed something, we hadn't talked about it before, he echoed something I've been worrying is too strong, pondering about, which is the difference between who you need to win a bid and who you need to run a program, and whether that's the same thing, and even whether actually, unless you are your kind of cluster, your partnership is already there, and you're really closely following the challenge and it fits in your structure, whether in actual fact what you need in the short term is a sort of job description for the perfect program director, and whether in fact that's sort of what we need, and if they're there, and if they're not there, you can be credibly going to find them during the time when the next rounds of the bid are happening. I don't know, I'm not allowed to say officially that because it's not my process, but were I bidding, I would be worrying about trying to cast that person too soon, but I would be really looking hard at what kind of person they needed to be. So back to you, Doris, in terms of other tips. Lots of good tips and advice for us there. Specifically, the intersection between academic disciplines, what I'm fond of calling the anti-disciplinary nature of this piece of work. It's not about disciplines. It's not even really about working across disciplines. It's about finding a challenge and solving it, regardless of the disciplines. Where are the bear traps in reviewing it?
I'll start from the positive side. I think what you want from your team of reviewers is actually what Andrew was talking earlier about, what you want from your partnerships, which is a shared vision of what the program is about. And the team that's explained the program, I think, has presented quite a unified front of what it is you think that program is about. So the challenge for you guys, I think, is going to be to translate that into your reviewer team. And where I've seen that done really, really well is by the European Commission on their Framework 7 programs.
Okay.
So they put a lot of effort into briefing the reviewers before the reviewing processes about, and by the way, not just academic reviewers, the Commission had and not just academic reviewers and not just reviewers in that particular discipline that the call was about. So they had really elaborate explanations of what did they want to see and what topics did they want discussed in a bid. And it was very helpful the way they separated out kind of more the sort of professional crafting aspects of running a partnership, the management structure, the risk management, all those kinds of things, from the meaty bits of what were the challenges, how were they articulated, and what was a sort of conceived to be a good articulation of what a partnership wanted to do.
Really
so it was a lot of briefing and then separating out what they wanted the reviewers to focus upon, and those were even kind of spatially and then timely differentiated conversations.
Fascinating. Interesting. Julie, did you want to chip in on that? No. Okay. Just more generally.
Yeah, no, I was partly trying to indicate that set out and it.
Okay, fine. So that's good. See, that I was bringing it in bang on time as well, which is good. That was really incredibly helpful. Closing then, before I hand over to Julie to just close the entire session and go to lunch, and then this afternoon it's the bid development workshop. If you were me, or not me, but the programme, what's the one thing that will be keeping you awake at night about what we're trying to do? I'm going to go that way down the panel.
I think in terms of picking your 8, it's getting that spread of things that are sufficiently focused that there's a core identifiable challenge proposition that will give you a compelling narrative when you're trying to evidence it, and a mix across those 8 of addressing the wider sort of sector challenges. Because yes, there is that cluster focus which makes complete sense, but also from our perspective, trying to support all of UK arts and culture. It's trying to extract from those different clusters.
The whole being greater than the sum of the parts.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I've seen too many programs where, to make your numbers up, they sort of support sort of any creative or any business. So that's why I want to make sure there's that sort of depth of understanding first. So there's a really strong set of people sort of involved who are helped through this process. So I just worry sometimes it's easier to just target the obvious people and not really help. Yeah, basically, loads of others who could really add value. So
yeah, I think that's a good and fair challenge.
Can I just observe?
Yeah.
It should connect with the actual broader sector deal. So obviously DCMS, DCLG would like to see that happen in some way as undefined. So it's worth tracking how that works, because this would clearly be the innovation component, of that would be signed off by this. My understanding.
That would explain why I'm spending most of tomorrow afternoon at DCMS.
It probably will.
Kate?
Having a meaningful cluster, so having a meaningful network that works for all the sums of all its parts.
Right.
Small businesses, people who work on their own out of their spare room, they've got to be part of that. They've got to make time for networking and building those relationships. So yeah, that sort of making it work for everybody.
That's related to the kind of what is a job, what is not a job, what is meaningful economic activities. And somebody said to me on a panel the other day, sort of connected to this, it's only the gig economy if you're being exploited. In the creative economy, it's just a gig, which I thought was quite interesting. So it sort of felt like it was too neat, and I sort of criticised it. I thought, no, it might be quite good, and that idea. Doris, what would keep you awake if you were sitting in my seat?
What would keep me awake is how to keep a conversation going between the people who are interested and who are then going to submit bids that encourages people to demonstrate, to be bold enough in the face of having to demonstrate that everything is thought through to the detail. Because obviously once you start writing your program, getting your partnership up and running, there's lots of detail that needs ticking. And my worry would be keeping people encouraged to still be bold and to not get too lost in that detail. And that's maybe something to take into the November surgeries.
I think that's an absolutely fair and brilliant challenge, and it already keeps us kind of busy in the sense that David touched on it earlier. This is public money. You cannot. The balance of risk and public money is a challenging place to sit, and we have made it as clear as we can that we want the program to be responsive. Maybe you spend a chunk of the first year actually working out, having defined the big Russian doll of the challenge, what the next couple of Russian dolls are, and that might be credible methodology for that, could be a good thing for a bid. But on the other hand, that cannot become, we don't really know, we'll work it out forever over the next 5 years, but we'll definitely spend the money on it. And nobody would bid that, of course, but things have happened that have done that. So we're very conscious of that, and that plays into the measurement, the kind of how will we know we've done well piece, because that will have to evolve at the same time. And one of the things that genuinely does keep me awake at night is how we avoid strangling the life out of partnerships by over-measuring them in the wrong way. And I don't think that's HRC particularly. It's nobody's intention to do that. But there are so many competing demands on the measurement piece. And I'm sort of hoping the Policy and Evidence Centre, by the time we get to the end of this, has helped to sort of substantiate, at least in part, because its job is not to measure the clusters, although if the clusters are a big bit of the UK creative economy, they should be measured within it. But maybe they can help build up some slightly more sort of developed measures, and that will help us do that. Look, enormous thanks to the panel and to you for your time. So John and David and Kate and Doris, I'm going to hand to Julie to just wrap up this session, and then I think it's time for lunch. Are you doing it from back there or up here? Thank you very much to the panel.
I'll just do it from over here. It's really a quick shout out for this afternoon. But first of all, just thank you everybody for coming this morning. Thanks to our speakers, thanks to the panel, as Anthony said. Thanks also to Andrew, team, and to Anthony for really helping shape this morning's event. We hope it's clear now what this is and what this isn't, and you've also had lots of advice from the panel. So in terms of how to put one of these together that really works, is meaningful, and so on and so forth. This afternoon, we go into a more detailed session, which is really designed to help support you in preparing the bids that you're preparing. So we encourage you to stick around. There'll be lots of roundtable discussions led out by the AHRC team, going into much more detail about what's in the core documentation. But before then, there's lunch outside, and a number of us will still be around and very happy to answer questions and to continue the discussion. Okay, thank you very much.